tính cái ca được cái quyền để mà làm dạ tâm ơi, dạ tâm chắc ớt rồi đó.
Rồi làm liền đi, để mình phải làm. Ở đây có nhân viên rồi. Dạ. Máy không ạ? Dạ em đưa. Dạ. Bên đây là ba đường trai rồi.
Chairman of the Human Rights, and he also is the author of the Human Rights Act.
Hey, Mary, this is Scott.
Oh, I think
I'm with Chris right now. And he said he's asked how's for staff. Frankly, so you know this, right?
And it also says that Vietnam does not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking and isn't taking the steps necessary to get into compliance. So I'll continue to work with Senator Bozeman and others on that important bill. The second item I wanted to mention is a closely related bill, the Vietnam Human Rights Sanctions Act, S-929 by Senator Quyền. And that would take an essential step coupled with the Human Rights Bill. It would put sanctions in place, financial, immigration, other sanctions against key Vietnamese leaders until, again, we see major progress in human rights. Again, it empowers us in that cause. We have seen in many different instances around the world that we often only get other countries' attention when we have to go so far as to impose sanctions. For instance, the only reason we have any meaningful discussions or negotiations with Iran right now over nuclear weapons is by imposing sanctions. And we should do exactly the same thing with the government of Vietnam until they make meaningful, significant progress on human rights. The third area in which I'm particularly focused is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a key trade agreement being negotiated now. Vietnam is a part of that negotiation. It's one of the countries in that group. And I strongly support having our negotiators, having our U.S.
I am a doctor, so as some of you know, a lot of folks from Vietnam have hepatitis B. And in my clinic, I have I'm a liver doctor. So in one sense, I've had that experience. So one thing Congressman Gallo and I have worked on is expanding screening for hepatitis B among folks from Asia and the South Pacific. And that was a direct product of knowing. Also, Congressman Gallo is a personal friend. We came at the same time. Our daughters are about the same age. And so when we were sworn in, our daughters were playing with each other on the benches in the house as he and I were taking the oath of office. And it's one of my favorite pictures. And then lastly, you are, I am, we are Americans. And we know each other not as a Vietnamese American or as a non-Vietnamese American. We know each other as Americans. And I thank you for your service to our country. One of the ways we serve our country is to promote our values to those who are elsewhere. Ronald Reagan, quoting another, said that the United States of America is a bright, shining city upon a hill. Now, we're a bright, shining city because of the values that we represent. Those values are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from a capricious government coming and imprisoning us for things that we did which are not wrong, but which merely offend a government official. role as an American is to highlight in Vietnam those issues where our values are not represented. When I say our values, I don't speak of American values, I think of universal values. And your unique role as an American is to represent what is happening in Vietnam so that your fellow Americans, so that we all can advocate for those rights for all people, no matter where they live. And you have a particular role. You're here in Washington, D.C. You are politically engaged. I'm a representative. I can only represent if you bring to me the knowledge I need to have in order to advocate for our common values. Thank you. I say it just to put it out there. It is also when you go home, you will meet with your congresswoman or your congressman, your senator, and you will help them understand that which Han Gao has helped me understand. That is that there are human rights issues in Vietnam. Among those, Father Lee, who's in prison, bloggers who are in prison. You have helped me understand the people who are beaten, the Buddhist monks who are persecuted. Not for doing anything wrong, but for practicing their faith. Now, the United States has some things we can do. Senator Vitter just mentioned trade agreements, other bills. I won't go into that. Rather, I will emphasize what he said. They will not pass unless you are engaged. I can never represent as well as you the tragedy that is human rights in Vietnam. So our common task is to spread to those around the world those things that we hold to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and have inalienable rights. And that is true whether you are in the United States, or whether that is true if you are in Iran, or that is true whether you are in Vietnam, and I can go down the list for every place that it is true. Now, I will tell you, you have no difficulty reaching me. My next-door neighbors are originally from Vietnam. We cut a hole in the fence so that my daughters can walk back and forth, and their best friends are the Con girls, Sheila and Lila. Their parents are wonderful people. Han Gao is a personal friend. I have patients, as I mentioned earlier, who are originally from Vietnam. Your task is for those who don't have that point of personal contact as do I. And this will be very easy for you. Whether through your church or temple, through your work, through your business place, or through a school board, when you find the local official that can represent the views that we hold to be so valuable, acquaint yourself with them, acquaint those who are in your community, wherever that community is, to represent those values, and then we can make a difference. I thank you again for being here. I thank you for allowing me to join you, and I thank you for the privilege of serving you and all of our fellow Americans on such an important issue as human rights in Vietnam. Thank you.
Và tiếp tiếp là chúng tôi sẽ mời thượng nghị sĩ Ben Cardin from Maryland.
We would like to invite the most important person in our advocacy process is Senator Ben Cardin from Maryland.
Welcome to Washington. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I know that several of my colleagues have already come by to say hello on Vietnam Advocacy Day. Let me just underscore some points that have already been made. Your presence here is very, very important. You all have busy lives. You have busy lives taking care of your families, working in your community. But you find time to be here because you know how important these issues are. So I first and foremost really thank you for being here to speak out on behalf of basic human rights. America's strength is in its diversity. The Vietnamese Americans have helped build a stronger America. America's strength is in its values, its respect for the basic rights of every person. That's what this nation is about. I wear several hats in the United States Senate. I serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I chair the East Asian Pacific Subcommittee. But I also chair the U.S. Helsinki Commission. The commission was established in 1975 with the basic principle that you cannot have a stable government, you cannot have a country that can succeed unless it respects the rights of all of its citizens. These are international. These are basic in what we believe in as a nation. So I support President Obama and his rebalance to Asia. That's important. And I am pleased that President Obama, President Tsang, entered into a U.S.-Vietnam comprehensive partnership. That's important. Vietnam is critical to the U.S. rebalance to Asia. Why? It's an important country on cultural, on economic, on strategic values. And we want to strengthen those ties. On economics, we've had 20 years of open trade between the United States and Vietnam, and we're negotiating Trans-Pacific Partnership. That would be good for Vietnam. It would be good for the United States. It would increase commerce between our countries. We need Vietnam's help on the environmental issues. Lower Mekong Delta Initiative, an important initiative. Every country needs to work together to protect our planet for future generations. We need Vietnam's help. We need Vietnam's help on security issues. The South China Sea is strategically important to global commerce. We need a code of conduct so that countries respect each other in that region. That's critically important to the United States. But for us, to be able to move forward with that strategic partnership, Vietnam needs to prioritize human rights.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
There are serious problems in Vietnam today. You know that. People are in jail just because they express their views. That's wrong.
Yes, it's wrong.
They're labor camps. And I'll tell you, I don't expect miracles overnight. We don't expect Vietnam to change overnight. But they must make constant progress to advancing human rights.
Yes, yes. 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 Right, right. Human right for Vietnam. Yes.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
The senator is extremely busy, so he will give us time for 2 questions. Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask? Yes, Dr. Gill.
Senator Ben Cardin, on behalf of the Vietnamese gathering here, we would like to thank you so much for your defending the human rights and the religious freedom, not only in America, but also all over the world. Like we have supported a few years ago the Russian Sanction Act about the Vietnam Human Rights S1649 and also the Vietnam Human Rights Sanction Act S929. We would like to ask what is your position in supporting these 2 STOs?
Well, as I think our record is fairly clear. I am the author of the Magnitsky law that imposes sanctions on countries that, on Russia that does not respect basic human rights. We are voting on a sanction bill today in the United States Senate as it relates to Ukraine. Let's be clear. We want relations with other countries. That's in global interest. And we want to improve our relationships with other countries. Other countries must respect the rights of all of its citizens. And that's a basic principle. We will offer incentives to encourage democratic reforms. But we will also offer sanctions if they do not make the progress that is necessary. That's our responsibility.
Yes.
Commissioner Andy Wynn. Senator, you are obviously a champion for human rights, not only for Vietnam, but throughout the globe. And for that, I thank you. As we begin to engage the Senate in this process, it is important that we have the support. We know that without the support, all chances of success is quite low. Would you consider designating a staff member of your team to act as a liaison person between all community and your office, sir?
Oh, absolutely. We make sure that that is done as a reasonable request, and I will make sure that we have direct contact with your advocacy group to get your information so that we can be more effective in working together for common strategy. Absolutely.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'll be relatively brief because I'm going to
chụp hình luôn
here. One, I want to thank you all for coming. Two, I want to thank Joseph and Dr. Tom and for helping, and all of you who helped put this together. You all know what the issues are, so there's no need for me to go in. You've heard Ben Carter, my good friend, talk about those issues. I think for your community, and I come from an immigrant family. My dad was sent home from school in Philadelphia because he couldn't speak English. And the history of immigrants who have come here to mainstream, and that's what I was so sorry to see Congressman Gal leave Congress, is to really stick together. You should make the issue of human rights and religious freedom in Vietnam one of the major issues in the 2016 election. I'm not saying to the other both parties, because you don't want to make this a Republican issue or a Democratic issue, both parties need to sincerely embrace this issue. And quite frankly, if you look at the history of Soviet Jewry, what they did in the 70s, working with Scoop Jackson and Jackson Banning, is unless there's a punishment and a threat to the government, as there was to the government of the Soviet Union, nothing will actually change. Quite frankly, I think the TPP ought not pass unless they really respect human rights and religious freedom. And when you're over in the Senate today, you should tell every senator, whether he be a Republican or Democrat, to bring up Congressman Chris Smith's bill. He's passed it 4 times in the House. Republican and Democrat bipartisan. It has to be brought up in the Senate. Otherwise, the government of Vietnam won't really care, and our government won't really take it seriously. Now, someone told me, and I don't know if it's true or not, that now the government of Vietnam just hired a high-powered lobbyist group to kill Congressman Smith's bill. We want to urge Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell to bring up the Vietnam Human Rights Bill. Bring it up. Thirdly, the State Department has to designate Vietnam as a CPC. If those things are not done, The Vietnam government will not care. I'm committed, even when I leave her, to do everything I can to help. You're good people. There's a large Vietnamese community in the Northern Virginia area. They're great citizens. They make great contributions. Stick together and use the model that the Jewish community used in the 70s and the 80s, working with Scoop Jackson and working with Congressman Vanek and others, to really do everything you can to make this one of the major human rights and religious issues of our times, and do it in such a way that every person running for office, whether they be a Republican or Democrat, running for the House, running for the Senate, and running for president, must publicly say and articulate what they will do on the issue of human rights and religious freedom. And I think if we do that, 10 years from now, we will see a dramatic change in Vietnam, but we will see a respect for human rights and religious freedom. But you just can't, someone just can't say what they're for, but we want to see. It's not only what they say, it's what they do. So work to that effort. Keep it bipartisan. But by 2016, wherever you live, who's ever running for Congress, who's ever running for the Senate, who's ever running for president, if they can't articulate what they are going to do for human rights and religious freedom in Vietnam, do not vote for them.
Yes. Do not vote for them.
Because if they commit that they will articulate and advocate for those who are being persecuted in Vietnam, then give them your support. Thank God bless you.
Ông dân biểu Frank Wolf nói một lời tôi muốn nhắc lại. Ông nói là trong cái mùa bầu cử tới đây năm 2014 và năm 2016, nếu mà những người dân biểu và thượng nghị sĩ nào hay là những người dân biểu tổng thống nào mà không có ủng hộ nhân quyền cho Việt Nam, chúng ta sẽ không có bầu cho người đó. Chúng ta phải tranh bầu cho Việt Nam và tranh đấu cho cái sự nhân quyền và tự do trên nước Việt Nam của chúng ta. Our next speaker is Hòa thượng Thích Kiến Như. Xin mời Hòa thượng.
Kính thưa tất cả bà con, thì tiếng Anh của tôi không giỏi đủ để mà nói hết những ý của mình, nhưng tôi sẽ nói cái lời tiếng Anh. First, thanks to the government and the people of the United States helped Vietnam before April of 1975. After that, still have us. We are living now in the United States, about more than 2 million people now. All the help of the people and the government of the United States, we are now living here. Today, I want to ask the government of the United States to continue to help us about the human rights in Vietnam. We know the living, the right, the reward trên năm Việt Nam, công nhân ở tại miền Nam Việt Nam. Rồi sau đó tiếp tục nhiều vị tổng thống cho phép dân tị nạn Việt Nam từ các ở Mã Lai, ở Việt Nam đến đây. Đầu tiên người ta chỉ cho 130.000 người thôi, nhưng sau đó hàng triệu người được đến nước này. Và ngày hôm nay chúng ta trở thành những công dân Hoa Kỳ, chúng ta có bổn phận đóng góp cho sự thịnh vượng của nước này. và chúng ta thường quên rằng chúng ta là con cháu của ở Việt Nam, chúng ta có ông bà, cha mẹ, tổ tiên văn hóa chúng ta ở đó. Chúng ta muốn rằng chính quyền Việt Nam hãy thay đổi để cho tất cả mọi người đều có quyền có tài sản, đều có quyền đi lại, đều có quyền tôn giáo, đều có quyền hội họp, và tất cả những điều cần thiết để làm cho nước Việt Nam mạnh hơn, tốt hơn và không để cho những phức tạp hết. Chúng ta phải làm cho
quý vị, với thời gian cho phép có hạn, chúng tôi cũng sẽ nói lên đây đầy đủ tất cả các chi tiết mà nhà nước Cộng sản Việt Nam đã đàn áp, ngược đãi tín đồ giáo hòa hảo. Tuy nhiên, chúng tôi cũng xin trình bày một số trường hợp điển hình như sau. Thứ nhất, từ sau ngày 30 tháng 4 năm 75, nhà nước Cộng hòa xã hội chủ nghĩa đã ra lệnh giải tán toàn bộ các ban trị sự giáo hòa hảo và tịch thu toàn bộ cơ sở của giáo hội. Mãi đến năm 1999, họ mới cho tái phục hoạt với một cái ban trị sự mới do nhà nước dàn dựng, phần lớn là các chức vụ quan trọng là các cán bộ cộng sản hoặc là những người không có tôn giáo nắm giữ, điển hình như là ông Nguyễn Tất Đạt, phó ban thường trực ban trị sự trung ương. Thứ hai, các tín đồ Phật giáo Hòa hảo thành lập các đạo tràng để cùng nhau học hỏi giáo lý, tổ chức kỷ niệm các ngày lễ đạo tại tư gia đều bị ngăn cấm, tù đày và bị đánh đập hết sức để dã man. Điển hình là các cộng đạo như là Nguyễn Văn Lía, Võ Văn Thanh Liêm, Bùi Văn Trung, vân vân và vân vân. Hiện tại chúng tôi có danh sách 9 tín đồ Phật giáo Hòa hảo đang bị trong tù với những cái tội danh mà họ không bao giờ phạm phải. Thứ ba, một trong đại lễ Phật giáo Hòa hảo là ngày 25 tháng 2 âm lịch, ngày mà toàn thể tín đồ Phật giáo Hòa hảo tổ chức hàng năm để kỷ niệm ngày Đức Tôn sư sa vắng tín đồ, ngày mà nay đã không được nhà nước cho phép và ngăn cấm triệt để. Chúng tôi xin có một vài đề nghị như sau. Thứ nhất, trả lại những cơ sở của giáo hội Phật giáo Hòa hảo mà nhà nước đã tín dụng sau ngày 30 tháng 4 năm 75. Thứ hai, các ban trị sự phải do tín đồ Phật giáo Hòa hảo bầu chọn mà không phải chịu dưới bất cứ áp lực nào. Thứ ba, cho tổ chức các ngày lễ đạo và cho tất cả mọi người đều được tham dự như trước ngày 30 tháng 4 năm 75. Thứ tư, chính quyền Việt Nam đã lập tức phóng thích tất cả các tù nhân Phật giáo Hòa hảo nói riêng và các tù nhân chính trị tôn giáo nói chung. Thứ năm, hiện tại Việt Nam là một thành viên nhân quyền trong Liên Hợp Quốc. Chính phủ Việt Nam đã biết tôn trọng nhân quyền, tín ngưỡng, chấm dứt tệ nạn buôn người, cưỡng chế lao động, vân vân và vân vân. Chúng tôi hiện diện ngày hôm nay để đồng xưng các tổ chức nhân quyền Hoa Kỳ, nhân quyền thế giới, Liên Hợp Quốc, vân vân phải có biện pháp chế tài đối với chính quyền Việt Nam. Sau đây chúng tôi xin có một vài lời đối với biên giới Hoa Kỳ. Xin lỗi, tại vì thời gian không cho phép nên ra chúng tôi không có thể nói một vài lời tiếng Anh cùng với chính giới Hoa Kỳ ở đây. Xin cảm ơn quý vị.
Và sau đây chúng tôi xin mời cô Bảo Trăng Phạm đại diện cho Việt Liên huyện Cao Đài, Tây Ninh.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bao Zhengfang. On behalf of the United Diocese and Holy See Overseas, I would like to respectfully thank all members of the House of Representatives, the Senate, the U.S. government, the organizing committee, the American people, the spiritual leaders, and the Vietnamese communities for caring about democracy, human rights, and freedom for Vietnam. As Vietnamese Americans, we are victims of the Vietnamese Communist Party, and today we come here for the common purpose: democracy, human rights, and freedom for Vietnam. We have the responsibility to build the United States of America, to become a great nation so that it can fulfill its mission for spearheading democracy, human rights, and freedom in the world. We also have responsibility to help the Vietnamese people in our homeland by assisting them to reach their dreams for human rights and religious freedom, which are enjoyed by all ordinary citizens. In addition, as human beings, we have the duties with ourselves, family, society, country, and humanity to perform good deeds. Vietnamese people have been suffering since the Communist Party took over South Vietnam on April 30th, 1975 by force. Human rights and religious freedom are not respected. Even the right to express their patriotism is not permitted by the Vietnamese community party, which has been controlling all aspects of citizens' life. The Vietnamese Communist Party forces them to follow their ideology and policies. It is unacceptable for the Vietnamese people. Now it's time for change. The presence of our communities overseas is in free, democratic, and advanced nations all over the world, especially the United States of America, gives us great strength and a rare opportunity which we have yet to have in our history. We can change Vietnam into a nation whose governments respect the rights of all its citizens, regardless of what their beliefs may be, and respect the rule of law, and change Vietnam from a poor, underdeveloped country into a flourishing and advanced nation.
Yeah.
All communities overseas must unite together for a common voice in the international arena to help fellow Vietnamese at home who have been suffering due to their advocacy for democracy, human rights, and freedom. We have to praise their noble sacrifice for Vietnam and support them in what ways we can in their fight for this just cause. On our part, the United Cao Dai Tinh Nhân Holy Sees, we have been working and will continue to work with all religious organizations, Vietnamese communities, international human rights organizations, and government of democratic nations in advocating democracy, human rights, and freedom for Vietnam, which is our purpose here today. Therefore, we would like to request the U.S. Congress pressure the Vietnamese Communist government to respect human rights and religious freedom for Vietnam.
The next person I would like to invite, the representative for the Mountain Yard Christian Church, Reverend E. Henry.
Tôi xin đại diện cho tất cả tiếng nói của Montanya Christian Việt Nam và Free to Thailand và cùng nhau bây giờ đông số tại Hoa Kỳ. Xin tất cả Montanya Christian đứng lên cùng chung với nhau. Chúng tôi ngày hôm nay là chúng ta không nhắc đến nhiều điều, nhưng mà trong cái sự tàn bạo, đàn áp tôn giáo và dân tộc của dân tộc Thường tại cao nguyên, cho nên thì chúng tôi luôn luôn đứng bên cạnh các anh em người Kinh của chúng ta đều sống từ Việt Nam và qua Hoa Kỳ, và không chấm dứt lời nói. Ngày hôm nay đặc biệt, và tôi cũng kêu gọi và tất cả chúng ta phải nêu lên rất là mạnh mẽ, kêu gọi tự do dân chủ cho người Việt Nam là cái nhân quyền chúng ta rất cần tại Quốc hội. Là cho nên là dù một số nhỏ của dân tộc thượng từ cao nguyên đến Hoa Kỳ, chúng tôi cần đoàn kết với cái tiếng nói đó đến khi chúng ta sẽ có luật nhân quyền, đã có luật sẵn sàng cho tất cả. Điều chúng ta rất cần là một cái chìa khóa đem dân chủ và tự do cho Việt Nam. Và tôi cũng đại diện cái tiếng khóc hơn 300 và 400 người ở trong tù. Anh em họ rất là khổ lắm, vì tôn giáo, vì lễ đạo, không có súng đạn, chỉ có tiếng nói mà thôi, và họ bị tù đày đánh đập rất nặng nề. Cho nên cảm ơn về tinh thần tất cả đã đến. Chúng ta hãy hy sinh dù là snow, dù là lạnh hoặc là cái gì thời tiết ở Hoa Kỳ, và cảm ơn tinh thần đã đến sáng hôm nay và kêu gọi tất cả chúng ta.
Và sau đây chúng tôi xin mời Chủ tịch Cộng đồng Bùi Thế Pháp đại diện cho cộng đồng tại Orange County.
Kính thưa quý vị, ngày hôm nay tôi xin đại diện cho cộng đồng người Việt quốc gia Nam Cali. Tôi đã viết sẵn một cái bài 2 phút, nhưng mà ban chức yêu cầu tôi nói vắn tắt lại trong 1 phút, thành ra tôi xin nói rất là nhanh. Thank you, Congress, Woman Loretta Sanchez, Congressman Ed Royce, and Congressman Alan Lorenzo for giving the freedom-loving people of Vietnam hopes and the courage to continue their fight for basic human rights, freedoms, and democracy in Vietnam. Honorable Congress members, how many more people have to stand before you, share their stories of how they have lost their loved ones to human rights abuse before you will consider sanctions against the communist regime of Vietnam? How many more mothers have to shed her tears, begging you not to ignore the torture of the cry for help? How many more lives have to cut short, their dreams unfulfilled, and families destroyed before you take action? So today, I urge you to join us in defending those who are defenseless. Please don't just give them hopes, give them an opportunity to exercise their patriotic duties without fear and enjoy the simple, basic human rights. Member of the Congress, the powers is in your hands. I urge you to pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act S 1649 and the Vietnam Human Rights Sanction Act HR 4254 along with its companion bill S 929. I strongly urge you not to consider including Vietnam in the Trans-Pacific Partnership before the communist regime respect human rights and give the people the freedom and the liberty. by not supporting including Vietnam in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You are not giving them the seal of approval to continue the inhuman treatments and pave the way for the communist regime of Vietnam to do more to harm its citizens. I'm not here to convince how ruthless the communists can be. That you already know. I'm here to ask you to let your conscience guide your decisions. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker has been championing, she has been a champion for our cause for over 2 decades. She is Representative Zoe Lofgren from California.
Inviting me to be here for Vietnam Advocacy Day, and it's exciting to see so many of you here, not just in this room, but to see you all over the Capitol talking to people and spreading the word and helping to get additional support for our cause. I represent San Jose, California, which is home to one of the largest Vietnamese American communities in the United States. In fact, it has the largest Vietnamese population of any city outside of Vietnam itself. I know I've got some constituents here today. I was able to meet with a lot of people from home and from elsewhere, and as you know, the human rights situation in Vietnam remains dire. The Vietnamese government continues to oppress its citizens, including peaceful advocates for democracy, bloggers, religious minorities, and I think you also know that Reporters Without Borders ranks Vietnam 172nd of 179 countries in its press freedom index. In fact, Vietnam has one of the worst human rights records in the world. It's one of 14 countries that include Iran, Syria, Cuba, and Burma, listed as not free in Freedom House's Freedom on the Net, a 2013 report. And as we know, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, in its annual report, identified Vietnam as a Tier 1 country of particular concern, putting it in the company of countries like Iran and Iraq, in North Korea and Sudan. They found that the overall human rights record remains poor, that in the past year new decrees were issued prohibiting peaceful protest, limiting speech on the internet, tightening controls on journalists, and access to the internet cafes. At least 34 dissidents and human rights defenders were imprisoned, some to long sentences, and increased bilateral engagement in the areas of trade and defense have not led to improvements in religious freedom and related human rights in Vietnam. So what are we to do? Here in Congress, I co-chair the Vietnam Caucus, and we've been very active on these issues. As you know, it is a bipartisan effort, and we've had a lot to work on with so many people being harassed and detained and imprisoned. We sent letters to the Vietnamese government as well as our own State Department, and the President making sure that the government is aware of what Vietnam is doing. It's especially important as we continue negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now I'll tell you something that I announced in San Jose. I've told the President directly and the trade negotiator that unless there are enforceable, actionable provisions that will require Vietnam to improve human rights, I'm not going to. Just this month, my friend and colleague Ed Royce, the fellow caucus co-chair, and has introduced the Vietnam Human Rights Sanction Act. Of course, I am a co-sponsor of this bill. It would impose sanctions on the Vietnamese government officials who are complicit in human rights abuses. As you might know, my colleague Chris Smith, a fellow caucus co-chair, introduced again the Vietnam Human Rights Act. Of course, I am a co-sponsor of this bill. And the bill urges Vietnam to improve human rights, and it places limits on non-humanitarian assistance where specific targets are met. Now, the bill passed the House with an overwhelming vote, only 3 against, in last August. But we need action in the Senate. Congressman Smith is circulating a letter that I've signed on to, and I would ask, as you visit offices on the Hill, that you urge members to sign Mr. Smith's letter, because a lot of times members of Congress, it's not that they've decided not to do something, there's just so much incoming into each office. They really rely on their constituents to bring matters to their attention. So that is a service that you can do for our cause of freedom. I want to mention a bill that I introduced last April. I've reintroduced the Free Vietnam Act, which is fostering rights through economic engagement in Vietnam, that bars Vietnam from participating in the Generalized System of Preferences program. That's what they already have. And basically, we have some good co-sponsors, Congressman Connolly, Susan Davis, Alan Lowenthal, Loretta Sanchez, Brad Sherman, Frank Wolf. It's a bipartisan bill. And it basically says, we're going to take your trade preferences away unless you clean up your act. That's something else I would like to Now, as we work today on the Hill and over the last few days, I want you to think about how you can help educate members of the House and Senate. You know, it's always been a mystery to me that the United States Congress will become concerned, as we should have been, about conditions in Burma. Well, what about Vietnam? Let's raise that issue with them. As we talk about the overall issue of human rights in Vietnam, we can't forget about the individuals and the individual advocacy. I was so grateful to my friends and constituents who brought me the condition, the situation of Boy Thi Minh Hong, who is on a hunger strike in Vietnam. She is suffering from abuse. I did not know of her situation until Jane Doe in San Jose and others brought it to my attention. I've emailed the ambassador. I've asked him to intervene. And there are others in that situation. We have members of Congress adopted, each of us, prisoners of conscience, because as people brave enough in Vietnam stand up for human rights, stand up for religious freedoms, those of us who are in the free world need to stand up for them. Thank you for what you said.
Okay, now we have 2 minutes to stand up and take a short breather. So stand up, stretch out, and then we will begin the second portion of today's plenary session, which is a continuation of last year's Republican meetup. So that hour from 10:30 to 11:30 has been reserved to the leadership of the U.S. House.
Sau đây chúng tôi xin quý vị có 2 phút giải lao và sau đó chúng ta sẽ gặp gỡ vị lãnh đạo của Đảng Cộng Hòa.
Nhưng mà sau 11 giờ rưỡi mình vẫn tiếp tục. Đó là cái phần mà đại diện của chúng ta lên để phát biểu với lại chính chúng ta. Và quý vị ở lại đây tới 12 giờ. Sau 11 giờ rưỡi là xong cái phần của bên Đảng Cộng Hòa phát biểu của chúng ta thì chúng ta vẫn tiếp tục sinh hoạt. 11 giờ 15 bắt đầu một số đặc biệt là các quý vị bên cái nhóm bà mẹ Việt Nam chuẩn bị visa vài cái chỗ họp báo ở trên lầu giống như năm ngoái, nhưng mà năm nay mình đi sớm một chút và các cái giới truyền thông báo chí cũng ra ngoài kia.
The name of one Vietnamese leader in our state. They could not one. I asked them how many policy speeches they had given in the last election cycle to an Asian audience. Not one. Yet I was able to list all of their appearances in front of Univision and is not to in any way disparage any other valuable minority group of this country. However, there is one group that, because of their respectful silence, has been overlooked by the politicians in this country for far too long. So I've decided to be that annoying voice for these wonderful people to remind our politicians, you go to any high school graduation in America, and who is at the top of the graduating list? You go to any college and it's the same thing. But even more importantly, I challenge them to go to any nursing home in any of their communities and walk the hallways. See how many Asians you see in a nursing home. You don't. They're at home with their families being taken care of. These are the values that I've come to love and respect. And I will, to my last breath, spend all the time and resources I have if it requires humiliation or embarrassment, whatever is required. And I told a politician just the other day in the hallways here, I said, just because these people have chosen not to get some pots and pans out from underneath the sink and organize with signs and bang them together in front of your office to embarrass you in front of CNN or Fox News, doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means they've chosen not to. So I'm going to be that person in lieu of those other annoyances to get their attention. Thank you very much.
Now, James has made a promise to support our community, and there will be many young leaders in the future who will be the voice of the Vietnamese American community. Now, James, before 700 people, are you going to support those young people to become the next generation of our voices?
But it's not. My oldest son and I, Kobe, organized a website in Oklahoma called, you can all look it up, it's called theasianconnection.org. And the purpose for that is to connect communication between the Asian community, particularly the Asian youth, and the rest of the community. Here's what I've done. Each month, the Asian Connection, our little website, will select an outstanding Asian American high school student. And there will be several criteria. The most important for me is that that student must have shown that he or she is registered to vote and one other person has been registered to vote. That outstanding student will receive $500 at the scholarship. At the end of the year, from the pool of 12 students, we will select the most outstanding Asian student in Oklahoma. That person must have a certain GPA, some community service, and have registered no less than 5 other Vietnamese or Asians to vote. At the conclusion of that year, and upon the selection of that person, I have committed at least $10,000 of my own money, and if I had not received enough from the community, I would pledge $25,000.
Oklahoma, right? All right, our next speaker is the representative.
Xin gửi lời cảm ơn chân thành đến tất cả quý vị và xin chúng ta tiếp tục sẽ là những ngọn lửa để cho ngày hôm nay chúng ta trở về trên 30 phái đoàn từ nhiều khắp nơi trên toàn quốc cũng như là tại châu Âu và những quốc gia khác. Chúng ta sẽ tiếp tục là những ngọn lửa thôi thúc trong lòng những người đồng hương của chúng ta, nhất là những người thế hệ trẻ tiếp tục tham gia trong những sứ mạng sắp tới. Chúng ta nhất định sẽ thành công. Xin cảm ơn quý vị.
Rất đấu sáng. Có công xã mình có ở đây, có hàng trăm người đến đây.
Our next speaker is a person who just cannot stay away from our community. He was here last year, and he wants to be part of our advocacy process this year. I would like to introduce you Representative Rob Woodhull from Georgia.
Dân để ở lo trà này.
idea the scarf was this year? Because that was a fabulous idea. It is a fabulous idea, not just because this happens to be the coldest March I've ever experienced in Washington, D.C., but because you have thousands of tourists from around the country. They're all walking the same halls you all are walking during advocacy, and they think everybody else is a tourist. They don't realize that lobbying in Washington, D.C., advocacy in Washington, D.C., does not have anything to do with the law firms downtown. It has to do with the families who dipped into their own pocket to travel all the way to Washington to say, I have a concern that matters. And I promise you, it makes a difference. My constituents came in yesterday. I work for them. I'm a three-year congressman. I've been here 3 years, which means I'm young enough to still be taught. You all can still educate us and make us better. After November, more than half of the U.S. House of Representatives, Republicans and Democrats, will have been here 5 years or less. 5 years or less, which means I don't know everything there is to know about human rights in Vietnam, which means I don't know the history of the struggle for freedom in Vietnam, which means I don't know that folks take time out of their calendar to travel all the way to Washington, D.C. to make their voice heard until you put that appointment on my calendar. It is so important that you all are here. It is so important because I tell constituents back home, in civics class, they teach you that America is run by 51% of Americans. That's nonsense. Nonsense. America is run by the 51% of Americans who care enough to show up and participate. That's you. And it is so vital if this republic is to run the way our founders intended that it run. Can I get a show of hands of the folks who were lucky enough, as I was, just to win the birth lottery and be born here? Can I get a show of hands, folks, who were just born here? Now that's gonna tell me something. Let me get the other show of hands here. Where are the hands of my first generation folks who were here? Show me those hands instead. The reason I tell you that that is so important is because what I know about human rights, I learned growing up in Georgia, where my neighbors care about me and I care about my neighbors and we treat each other with dignity and respect. What I know about freedom, I learned in Georgia, where I'm allowed to go and protest against my government one day and attend my church the next day. And every day is just like that.
Sam.
The folks who have a chance to teach us in Congress, the folks who have a chance to change the way America leads in the world are those first-generation Americans who know what it is not to have human rights and then to have them. Who know what it is not to have freedom, but then to have it. Who know what it is to have family members who exist in a government where freedom of expression is not allowed, where freedom of religion is not allowed, where you can be jailed because of what is in your heart and because of what is in your head. If you don't tell that story to people like you who won the lottery and were just born in the land of freedom, who's going to tell it? The history books don't tell it. The way you sitting in my office, handing me the name of an individual who sits behind bars today because he or she dared to fight for freedom in Vietnam. Thank you. Thank you. There are going to be congressmen coming to this stage all day long. We get to stand here at the microphone, but the boss in the room is sitting in those seats right there. Exercise your ability to move this country, and we will all be a better people. Thank you very much.
Thằng nặng
Will
thứ nhất hết
you
trơn.
return with us
Tới đậu
next
xong
year?
rồi tin rồi.
Hey, if this group still loves this country enough and believes that being here matters enough to travel across the country, I will be here.
Nhất khó mà.
Ông phát biểu
Khó ghét
một lời rất là quan trọng và tôi muốn nói lại là tất cả những người dân biểu và thượng nghị sĩ ở đây họ không có biết về cái tình trạng của dân tộc chúng ta trong nước Việt Nam, họ không có biết về những cái sự đàn áp tôn giáo, những vấn đề dân chủ, những người mà bị bắt, bị đánh đập, họ không biết tới, cho nên họ cần tất cả những người ở trong cộng đồng chúng ta tới với họ, trình bày với họ và nhắc họ là phải cần lên tiếng và giúp những người trong nước của mình. Cho nên quý vị có mặt ở đây là một cái sự rất là quan trọng đối với họ. Cho nên một lần nữa xin cho mọi người vỗ tay.
Sau đây chúng tôi xin mời bác sĩ Trọng Phan từ đại diện từ Central Nhân.
Những thành công của quý vị đã đạt ra trong ngày hôm nay, tất cả quý vị.
Ra mặt đi. Công gì không vô kêu.
The next person who will speak to us is the second most powerful individual in the Republican Conference in the Senate. He has been a strong champion for the Vietnam human rights cause. He introduced the Vietnam Sanctions Act. He co-sponsored the Vietnam Human Rights Bill. And he will do everything that he can in order to promote democracy and religious freedom in Vietnam. And this is to say, it was through his...
From
Good morning.
Houston,
It's good
Texas.
to be with you today, and thank you for allowing me to come and share a few thoughts with you. But first, let me just say welcome to all of you. Of course, we miss Congressman Cal here on Capitol Hill, and I'm glad to know he's doing such important work, working with you and recognizing the serious threat to human rights and particularly religious freedom in Vietnam. But I know I had a chance to meet with a number of the Texans in the audience here today, and let me just ask, I see a few of the Texans here. Are you here this morning? Well, Texans aren't shy. Most Americans probably don't realize this, but Vietnamese is now the third most commonly spoken language in Texas, after English and Spanish. In fact, our state is home to more than 210,000 Vietnamese Americans in total, many of whom live in the Houston and the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and a number of whom hold political office across our great state. They've become, as well, business leaders, civic leaders, and more. Their collective story, your story, epitomizes the American dream of economic opportunity and upward mobility. One of the concerns that my Vietnamese American constituents share with me is that human rights violations in Vietnam don't receive nearly enough attention in the halls of Congress or in the press. I share this concern, which is why I'm so grateful for Congressman Cal in helping to organize events like this. 39 years ago, after the last U.S. helicopter pulled away from a rooftop in Saigon, America and Vietnam have grown increasingly close together in terms of our economic and defense ties. Indeed, our countries today have never been before shared as much in common when it comes to our security interests as we do today. But that does not mean we can or we should turn a blind eye to human rights abuses in Vietnam. Vietnam is nowhere close to being a genuine U.S. ally like Japan or South Korea. And the reason is simple. America's alliances with Japan and South Korea are underpinned by shared values. Values like freedom, democracy, the rule of law, minority rights. Despite our mutual concerns over the Chinese military power, America and Vietnam will never achieve a close relationship until Vietnam releases all political prisoners and it respects basic human rights and it embraces democratic pluralism. Some people might argue that America's primary interest is economic, or that we ought to strive for stability above all else. In other words, these same people argue that we shouldn't rock the boat too much on human rights and democracy. Here's the problem with that argument. No dictatorship will ever be truly stable. Even if a dictatorship appears to be stable from the outside, there's often a powder keg of turmoil and discontent working right beneath the surface. When that turmoil and discontent finally explode, we're reminded of just how unstable these authoritarian regimes really are. And in recent years, we've seen mass protests erupt everywhere, from Tunisia to Egypt, to Burma, to China, to Venezuela, and Argentina. In each of these countries, ordinary people have taken to the street to demonstrate against corrupt, autocratic governments that are failing to address their concerns, real human concerns. When we look at a country like Vietnam, a one-party state where a brutal dictatorship has wielded absolute power for several decades, it may be hard to imagine the day when government will release political prisoners, respect civil liberties, and hold free elections. Yet I would argue that the communist regime is more fragile today than it has ever been.
Chúng tôi đã xem từ nó lên đây đó, chúng tôi nhận được cái thông báo của văn phòng của cao ủy của Hội đồng Nhân quyền Liên Hiệp Quốc và các đặc phái viên, các điều tra viên đặc biệt của Liên Hiệp Quốc về vấn đề văn hóa, về vấn đề tự do tôn giáo, vấn đề gia cư. Họ đã ra một cái thông cáo về báo chí, press release, và họ thông báo rằng họ đã gửi một cái văn thư với lại văn phòng chính phủ, chính quyền Việt Nam để yêu cầu chấm dứt cái tình trạng cưỡng chế đã xảy ra tại doanh nghiệp dầu.
Như vậy chúng ta hy vọng là giáo sư sẽ được cứu. Và thưa quý vị vẫn đang theo dõi phần live show đặc biệt của chúng tôi được trình đến với quý vị từ Washington DC trong một cuộc vận động cho ngày cho nhân quyền Việt Nam. Và đây là một trong những cuộc gặp gỡ rất là quan trọng của cộng đồng người Việt chúng ta ở khắp nước Mỹ. Và thưa chú Chuyên với chú Phạm Long, không biết là hai chú có những câu hỏi thật đặc biệt nào gửi đến cho những vị quan khách của chúng ta trong buổi sáng ngày hôm nay không thưa hai chú?
Y'all is singular.
Josh.
Y'all's.
Josh.
Y'all's is plural. And all y'all's is plural possessive. So, all y'all's friend, Congressman Gow, is a whale of a guy. And we love having him here, and we love having you all here with us. One of the things I have learned from my Vietnamese American friends is their love of the American dream. They have sought it out, they have worked hard for it, and they know that every day they get up, they go to work, and they appreciate the opportunity to work for success and to earn that success. And I think that you share that message because you role model it, you live it every day for so many Americans, maybe that do not appreciate as fully as you do the power of freedom, the power of opportunity, and what opportunity brings to change the way you live your life. Isn't it wonderful that in America, the status of your birth or the status of your life in immigration does not determine the outcome of your life? You can make that difference. And I want to encourage each of you.
How many of us in here would want to sit down with President Marshall Claiborne and yell with her?
Well, all y'all are invited.
All right. We will come. Yes! Yes!
I just want to thank all of you for being here. First and foremost, I want to thank Joseph Cow. Cow, as a member of Congress, but even before he was a member of Congress, was a tremendous advocate on behalf of Vietnamese human rights. I remember meeting with him years ago, matter of fact, working with Dr. Tong, with Boat People SOS, when the Clinton administration wanted to send everyone back to Vietnam who were in places like High Island, in Hong Kong, and in other refugee camps. It was Dr. Tong who walked into my office and worked with Joseph Reese, Ambassador Reese. We were able to figure out that there were tens of thousands, and it turned out to be about 20,000, people who were improperly, unfairly, and unlawfully deemed to be non-refugees and were going to be forced back with what they called euphemistically voluntary repatriation, with a fist and with all kinds of means to get people to go back. It was Dr. Tong who inspired us to hold 4 hearings. He helped us draft an amendment to say that no U.S. funds can be used for that forcible repatriation. If the CPA is going to close, we will then re-interview those folks who have been improperly screened out. And as a direct result of Dr. Tong's leadership, and I'm Joseph Cow was right there throughout all of it, some 20,000 Vietnamese who otherwise would have been forcibly repatriated came to the United States. So, Dr. Tong, thank you for your leadership. Yesterday, Congressman Frank Wolf, who is the champion of religious freedom in the U.S. House and Senate, he is the quintessential champion of religious freedom rights, chaired yet another hearing on religious persecution in Vietnam. One of the witnesses was Father Lloyd. Father Lloyd spoke via Skype from his place, his home in Hue, and frankly, he was surrounded. His house was surrounded by secret police, and he spoke out boldly, he spoke out passionately, and spoke truth to power. I met Father Lloyd in 2005 while he was under house arrest. So yesterday I asked him with all the hype that if we just trade a little more with Vietnam, somehow they will matriculate from a dictatorship to a thriving democracy. Nothing could be further from the truth. And when you look at every indice or index of human rights observance, on religious freedom, whether it be the Unified Buddhist Church, and I've met with the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, I went to him when he was under House Pagoda, still is, arrest, and so many others, members of all the different faiths, including Christian faiths, And unfortunately, the bilateral agreement has not yielded the fruit that some had purported it would, and the repression has gotten even worse. Those who signed Block 8406, a great, magnificent human rights charter, have found themselves targeted because they have signed that document which mirrors the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and says, we demand freedom for every human being living in Vietnam. So Father Lloyd said yesterday that the abuse is getting worse, and he's living it, as are so many others. In 4 separate Congresses, I've authored what's known as the Vietnam Human Rights Act. Dr. Bozeman in the Senate has introduced it there, and that legislation has passed 4 times in the U.S. House of Representatives. 4 times. Last August, it passed once again. It is a comprehensive human rights piece of legislation that says we're serious about human rights and democracy. No funny words, no flattering words, no meaningless expressions. We tie it to increases in economic and other aid. We fence off humanitarian aid, believing that if somebody is sick or in need of help, that money will flow. But in other categories, we will restrict that money if certain benchmarks are not met. As you know, some of those benchmarks include substantial progress towards releasing all political and religious prisoners, those under house arrest, and other forms of detention. Substantial progress towards free religion, assembly, speech, independent media, unsanctioned religious activity. We know that the bloggers and the journalists, there has been a massive crackdown on those people. Many of them very young, idealistic Vietnamese who are out there blogging. Next thing you know, knock on the door, the secret police drives you away, and after a beating, you get a long prison sentence. Substantial progress towards repealing laws that criminalize peaceful dissent, as I said, independent media and the like. Substantial progress in the area of allowing free and open access to U.S. refugee programs without the bribes, without what has unfortunately marred the ability of so many good Vietnamese people to access those programs. Substantial progress towards respecting all ethnic minorities. Yesterday we heard at Frank Wolf's hearing 2 outstanding representatives, one from the Hmong and one from Montagnard, who told how they are being repressed. I remember when the country of particular concern under the Bush administration was lifted in the hopes that the bilateral agreement would yield real progress in these areas. When that happened, one of the deliverables that we were told was that the forced renunciations of faith, particularly under the Montagnard, would cease and desist. That was not happening. And of course, the ability to register the church, even in a very unfair registration process, eludes many of those churches. And I think the number cited yesterday, 600. So they're almost forced to operate illegally, and whatever that means, because the freedom to worship and to act on your religious liberty is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the governments ought to just mirror that, not contradict it as Vietnam does. We also call for an end of complicity, government complicity, in the Vietnam Human Rights Act in the area of trafficking. Vietnam is one of the worst trafficker countries in the world, labor and sex, but especially labor. And again, I turn to Dr. Tong, who's done yeoman's work in revealing how Vietnamese are being exploited all over the world, and government officials are making huge sums of money off their sweat as they are unfairly treated or mistreated, to put it better. I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. We laid out the background, the framework for judging how a country is progressing. And Vietnam has failed miserably. They ought to be a Tier 3 country and therefore subject to a number of sanctions pursuant to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and they have not been put on that list by the Obama administration, and in like manner they have not been put on CPC list, country of particular concern, by the Obama administration. So while you lobby, please focus a bit on the White House and on the State Department. It is time for Tier 3 and CPC designations for Vietnam. Finally, we have a letter that we hope you'll take a copy of, and then it's a bipartisan letter asking Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell, but Harry Reid is the one who makes the call. And I would also say Senator Menendez as well, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, to bring up the Vietnam Human Rights Act for a vote.
Yes.
Senator Reid, and I don't know if he does or doesn't, just bring it up for a vote in the best democratic traditions. Allow the Senate to work its will. If it loses, it loses. And you, everyone here, will know where every senator stands. And if it goes down to the White House and it's vetoed by President Obama, then so be it. We need to know where people stand. Hiding behind process and refusing very pertinent human rights legislation to have its day is a very unfair, and it's unfair to all of you, but it's especially unfair to who are suffering torture and mistreatment at the hands of the secret police in Vietnam. Bring it up for a vote. Sign off that letter to Reid and McConnell, and I urge you to urge your member of Congress, and as you meet with senators, urge the senators as well to ask respectfully Harry Reid, bring it up for a vote. And again, if it fails, it fails. I believe it'll pass, and I believe it'll pass overwhelmingly. The senators want to vote on this. They care about human rights, and hopefully the president will sign it. Thank you.
Và sau đây chúng tôi xin trọng kính mời sư Sherin Mosby, đại diện cho Georgia.
Good morning. Xin chào.
Good morning.
My name is Sherin Mosby, and I'm an attorney in the Atlanta area. And I'm very happy to be a member of the Georgia delegation because many of my friends and the clients I serve in the Atlanta community are Vietnamese. And we need to stop the abuses by the Vietnamese government that have occurred since the fall of Saigon.
Yes.
Yesterday, the delegation and I had the pleasure of meeting with Representative John Lewis, who fought alongside with Martin Luther King Jr. during the American Civil Rights Movement. We were very happy when Representative Lewis announced his unequivocal support for the Vietnamese people and Vietnamese human rights when he considers trade agreements with Vietnam, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This support of Representative John Lewis.
Sure.
Thế thì khi mà chúng tôi nhìn thấy
Quán tuyên truyền sao cho nó vô vậy?
con đến với tinh thần cao
nói con từ cái thôi mà nó chịu nói mấy cái kia nó trúng mà
nhân tài của chúng ta không phải là chỉ ở những người trẻ và những người già thì chúng tôi thấy chắc chắn là nó sẽ vượt qua cái kết quả này. Thì cái đó là cái hy vọng và chúng tôi mong là năm sau nếu mà có dịp thì chúng tôi sẽ cùng đến thăm viếng quý vị trong cái ngày hội nhân quyền cho Việt Nam.
Mà những quốc gia lên diễn đàn không thể dùng mấy từ cộng được.
Tại giờ
Nói gì? Sinh đẻ thời cộng sản gì nữa dùng từ đó. Chỉ cộng sản dùng cái từ đó thôi, ai mà dùng từ đó. Ở nhà vài ba người thì không nói gì lên diễn đàn là cái từ ngữ phải kỹ lưỡng từ chữ.
Kính chào quý vị và tất cả đồng hương. Thật tình tôi rất cảm động. Vietnam Advocacy Day. It is time for us to stand up together, to speak up for those who cannot be heard in their own country. It's time for us, for every one of us, to give a hand to help them claim for justice and freedom, human rights, and democracy in Vietnam. We are confident that by acting together, our dream come true. Thank you very much.
Now, thank you all for being here. This is how representative government works. And I so appreciate you traveling from all across the country to come to your nation's capital and to participate in representative government, to knock on people's doors and make them aware of what your priorities are. And I'm so pleased as we stand here today that we can say that the House has acted, that the House has passed the Vietnamese Human Rights Act, that the House has and we did it together. So let's continue to work to advance issues that are important to all of us as Americans. This is, as you know, this has been a new endeavor that we've taken on just in the last year. This is the second Vietnamese American meetup. But my goal as chair of the conference is to make sure that we are having a conversation with everybody in this country about, no matter where you live, no matter your background, no matter what corner of the country you come from, about the future of this country, but also the important role that America plays around the world. And that it is important that America's influence that continues around the world. And it's important for America to be a leader. It's important that America is economically strong. It's also important that America is militarily strong, because I do believe that America continues to be a force for good. I wanted just to share with you that as Republicans, our vision for people in this country is to ensure that you are not bound by where you come from, but that you are empowered by what you can become. That is what we are focused on. Our vision is one that empowers people, not the government. It champions free markets, and it trusts people to make their own decisions, not a government that decides for you.
And pressure, as we do with this new legislation, with the Sanctions Act, target those officials in Vietnam, as well as support to the government of Vietnam, so that they know there's a consequence, so that they think, no, I'm going to travel to the United States. My family's going to come with me. My wife is going to shop. We're going to spend money. We're going to invest. We're going to send our children there to go to school. No, no, no. We need to sanction those who use force against the people of Vietnam. We need to do that for this. We need the Vietnam Human Rights Act and my legislation previously that we passed in the House to put Vietnam back on the CPC list. We need to do that. Let me also share with you that Joseph Gao, our former congressman from Louisiana, did such a magnificent job up here. He and I just finished a press conference, but I wanted to tell you how much other members learned from him, but how much they can learn from you as you go around to the offices and you talk to the staff members and you talk to members of Congress. We want you to do this. We want you to push this legislation right now. Janet Nguyen is the supervisor in Orange County. She and I had a press conference on the legislation. H.R. 4254. Now that's my bill, the Vietnam Human Rights Sanctions Act. I hope you will ask members of Congress to support this. Ask the staff to have their members co-sponsor the legislation. And then back home in your states, call the congressman and ask them to co-sponsor this legislation. I'm the chairman of the committee. I'm going to bring this up. When I bring it up, I want to have as many co-sponsors as possible. I want to have a big vote, a big message, send this bill into the Senate, and then we'll start our work there. But I very much appreciate all of you being here. Thank you so very much.
Dạ vâng, thưa quý vị, chúng ta còn 5 phút nữa trước khi mà chúng ta rời khỏi cái phòng này để mà ra ăn trưa. Này là chúng ta cũng bắt đầu đói, thì xin quý vị kiên nhẫn một chút. Ông Catroy là người mà ông ta là chủ tịch của Ủy ban đối ngoại của Hạ viện. Chính ông ta là người vừa mới đưa ra cái luật chế tài các vi phạm nhân quyền ở Việt Nam. Ông ta kêu gọi 6 ngày hôm nay chúng ta về lại thành phố của mình, tiểu bang của mình, chúng ta hãy gọi điện thoại cho dân biểu để yêu cầu họ đồng bảo trợ cho cái luật đó để được thông qua thật nhanh ở Hạ viện, và chúng ta cũng sẽ làm như hiện như vậy ở tại Thượng viện. Bây giờ chúng tôi xin mời cô Khalila Pomone Kalina.
Thấy là ai vậy?
Đại diện cho cộng đồng người Cham.
Cham. Chà, nó cũng thuộc về người gốc Việt Nam mình hay gốc nước khác vậy? Nguyên hả?
The IOC is excited to participate in the Advocacy Day for Vietnam. It was vital that the IOC join
Khác dòng giống Việt Nam hả?
freedom and justice to the people in Vietnam. It is our duty to bring a voice to those who
Nó
have to
như
fight for
người
themselves
Khờ Mông cũng
without
có người gốc
facing
Việt
persecution,
nhưng mà họ thiểu số.
bring justice for those suffering
Khờ Mông không phải người Việt Nam.
injustice, and protect and preserve the land and culture of
Dân tộc thiểu số
Burma
trong
and
nước
Vietnam.
nó cũng là người Việt Nam.
We want to take every
Còn
opportunity
Chàm
to
thì
shed
nó là
light
nước
on the
khác.
injustices facing the indigenous people of Vietnam. To start, we want the Vietnamese government to acknowledge the facts and to start recognizing indigenous peoples as such. Their land should not be illegally confiscated, putting their livelihoods in jeopardy. Nuclear power plants should not be built on these illegally confiscated lands, putting the entire country at risk of nuclear contamination. They should not continue being exploited, but work in conjunction with building and developing a country that is free and economically, environmentally sustainable. Thank you.
Tôi muốn hỏi thăm có ông Nguyễn Hữu Trung ở đây không ạ, bên cao đài?
Hữu Trung cao đài.
Dạ đâu ạ? À vâng, xin mời ông Nguyễn Hữu Trung lên đây ạ.
Khi mà các cháu tuổi trẻ ở hải ngoại mặc dù không sống sinh trưởng ở Việt Nam, sống tại Hoa Kỳ, đầy đủ phương tiện tổ chức cuộc sống ổn định, nhưng không quên đất nước như cháu vừa rồi đã phát biểu. Tôi rất là sung sướng và đặt niềm hy vọng, hoàn toàn hy vọng trong tương lai đất nước của chúng ta thay đổi nhiều cái tuổi trẻ ở tại hải ngoại. Xin chân thành cảm ơn các cháu. Không thể nào tôn tin tôi thổn thức, không thể nào ngăn được nước mắt khi nhìn vào cái cặp đôi nhà tang thương, những người đấu tranh bị đánh đập rất là tàn nhẫn, bị bức hại, bị bỏ tù, rồi bị đánh đập trong nhà tù như là con tôi chẳng hạn, nhưng nhiều lắm. Thì tôi cũng xin được trên đây quý vị, tức là thương đồng bào hải ngoại không chỉ là thương và chúng ta giúp đỡ là đủ. Kính thưa quý vị, hãy chủ tấm lòng để một cá nhân. Nếu cá nhân không đủ thì chúng ta cũng một nhỏ, chúng ta mời một nhỏ hoặc là một tổ chức giúp đỡ cho những người tâm ở trong nước bằng cách cái việc là họ quan tâm tới họ. Tức là khi quan tâm tới họ có nghĩa là chúng ta liên hệ với gia đình họ để theo dõi tình hình của họ, của tù nhân lương tâm từ khi bị bắt, xem thử họ có khó khăn gì chúng ta giúp đỡ về vật chất. Một người không được thì góp chung nhau, cùng nhiều người góp chung nhau để giúp đỡ. Nếu như cái tù nhân lương tâm đó có khi mà chưa ra tòa thì xem có cần pháp lý không, có cần luật sư không, thì quý vị giúp đỡ cho họ có luật sư v.v. Hoặc là xem thử họ trong tù có bệnh hoạn gì không, để thông qua gia đình họ để giúp đỡ họ chữa bệnh. Hoặc là khi họ bị tra tấn đánh đập, gia đình họ nói cho mình biết, thông báo cho mình biết thì mình kịp thời báo cáo lên các cấp, các cái tổ chức nhân quyền chẳng hạn như BPS hoặc là nhiều cơ xa để có biện pháp can thiệp của nhà nước Việt Nam để mà bảo vệ họ. Sau khi họ ra tù, nếu như họ được ra tù rồi thì chúng ta giúp đỡ họ ổn định cuộc sống. Đó là nguyện vọng thiết tha mà tôi khát khao mong muốn để được quý vị chăm lo cho những người nhân lương tâm, trong đó có con tôi, 2 người bạn của con tôi. Và cái tư của mình cũng xin thông báo cho quý vị mừng là con tôi được 2 người kết nghĩa, một việc kết nghĩa về tinh thần thôi, vì chị ấy khó khăn. Còn một người kết nghĩa với tôi, gọi là em kết nghĩa, đó là luật sư, tôi không biết tên nhưng mà ngày hôm qua luật sư ở với anh, tôi cũng xin giới thiệu với quý vị. Tôi rất là vinh dự và sung sướng và rất là hạnh phúc. Nhưng còn những tù nhân khác cũng đang cần quý vị giúp đỡ. Thì hôm nay đứng trước quý vị thì tôi xin như vậy thôi. Tôi rất là vui mừng và rất là hạnh phúc vì rất là vinh dự được ở đây. Xin cảm ơn quý vị.
Đừng quên rằng chúng ta đang ngồi ngay ở trung tâm quyền lực của quốc gia đại cường trên thế giới dân chủ và tự do. Chúng ta có thể làm được rất nhiều cho đồng bào. Chúng ta đừng quên rằng nhờ cái nhóm kỹ thuật của giáo sư Nguyễn Đình Liên Quốc và rất nhiều người khác không có mặt ngày hôm nay, và đồng bào của chúng ta trong 2 ngày qua đều theo dõi từng bước chân vận động của chúng ta ở tại Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ. Và bây giờ tôi xin mời anh Đen dân biểu Cao Quang Ánh, bác sĩ Hồ Trâm, anh Dũng Ngô, chúng ta hô một vài khẩu hiệu cho nó nở phổi để mà chúng ta còn có tinh thần chứng minh cái hào khí của chúng ta khi mà chúng ta đóng lại cái chương trình sáng nay, ra ăn trưa cho nó khỏe thêm nữa và vào trong cái hội nghị.
Bây giờ chúng tôi xin mời quý vị, chúng ta sẽ hô khẩu hiệu Việt Nam tự do, Việt Nam dân chủ. Xin mời quý vị đứng lên để thở cho nó dễ.
Việt Nam tự do, Việt Nam dân chủ.
Quý vị có nhớ đêm 25 chúng ta làm một cái buổi nâng cao tinh thần không ạ? Hôm nay chúng ta cũng làm một cái buổi nâng cao tinh thần để chúng ta trở lại và về địa phương của chúng ta tiếp tục ủng hộ. Xin quý vị đi theo chúng tôi la thật to khi kêu Việt Nam nhân quyền, Việt Nam tự do, Việt Nam
nhân quyền,
Việt Nam tự do, Việt Nam nhân quyền, Việt Nam
tự do.
Cảm ơn tất cả quý vị.
Đã dùng bữa cơm trưa và xin có mặt ở ngay tại các cái phòng, chúng tôi sẽ thông báo ở ngay ngoài kia các cái phòng để mà tham gia cái hội nghị. Dạ vâng, cái hội nghị xã hội dân sự.
Việt Nam ơi, thời gian quá nửa đời người và ta đã có thương rồi. Ôi cuộc đời ngày sau tàn lửa khó mẹ Việt Nam đâu từng cơn khóc lạ nhìn đời, người lầm than đau khổ nghèo nàn, kẻ cười vì giàu sang dối gian. Giờ đây Việt Nam còn ai đã mất đất bao ngang tàn trên quê hương ta. Hoàng trường ca đã bao người dân vô tội chết rồi. Xâm lược trong kẻ nhũ nhược ban nước Việt Nam. Việt Nam ơi, thời gian qua nửa đời người, ôi cuộc đời ngày sao tan mưa khói. Mẹ Việt Nam đau từng cơn khóc lạ nhìn đời, người lầm than đau khổ nghèo nàn, kẻ quyền vì giàu sang dối gian. Giờ đây Việt Nam còn ai đã mất xâm lược trong kẻ nhu nhược ban nước Việt Nam.
Nãy mấy người sĩ ra.
Mới nó bảo mới gì vậy mà thì nó sai bảo xấu giả như bạn không biết
Các ơi, bây giờ là ai sẽ phát trước, cạnh đài hay là cạnh đỉnh?
Delegation is one thing, unlike
Vậy Ai sẽ nói trước? Anh Lý nói chuyện trước thì mình sẽ phát audio thôi phải không?
Anh Lý Văn Dục, rồi sau đó mới tới anh Quốc Kiều nhé. Tôi sẽ định hợp chương trình mà anh nghe thôi, đừng nghe người đọc cả.
Anh 30 năm ơi. Okay.
Our panel discussion is about to begin, so if I ask that everybody please to be seated, xin mời quý vị vui lòng an toàn để chúng ta có thể bắt đầu chương trình đúng giờ. Chương trình ngày hôm nay chúng ta cần phải thu âm để làm lưu trữ hồ sơ cho Quốc hội, bởi vì chúng ta sẽ dùng ngôn ngữ bằng tiếng Anh, và xin quý vị đồng hương thông cảm. Còn khoảng 4 phút nữa chúng ta sẽ bắt đầu. Reporting and stopping abuses of human rights violations in Vietnam. As you know, one of the ways that we can work to stop and reduce human rights abuses in Vietnam and around the globe, we have to begin to identify those violations and bring those violations to light. That's the purpose of today's discussion. It is my distinct honor to have with us three panelist members. The first one is Ambassador Joseph Rees, and next is Mr. Quốc Dục, and third is Mr. Lý Văn Dục, who will come to us via the internet from Vietnam. Okay, a few ground rules so that we can have a constructive discussion and being able to achieve our purpose today. First, we will essentially, each panelist will have about 10 minutes or so to make their presentation. And the next part, we will have about 20 minutes, exactly 20 minutes to have a discussion. Chúng ta sẽ có khoảng 20 phút để có một cái buổi hội luận về cái đề tài đó. Và những người ở trong phòng này cùng những người ở trên internet, not only those who are present but also those who are participating via the internet will also get the opportunity to participate. So I ask that everyone keep your questions short, concise, and to the point. First, second, do not repeat the questions that others have asked. Okay, and third, please be considerate to your other participants as well as those participating from the internet. And then the most important part is the conclusion. At the conclusion of the panel discussion, we will have about 10 minutes to talk about action items. Vào phút cuối cùng chúng ta sẽ có 10 phút để bàn luận với nhau, để đưa ra một số những cái công việc mà chúng ta cần phải làm cụ thể. Chúng ta không thể chỉ nói suông, nhưng mà cần phải đưa đến đúc kết một số những cái công việc mà chúng ta cần phải làm. We will discuss and arrive and we will take a vote on 3 action items that we think need to be taken immediately and in the future. Okay, so that's the purpose of today's discussion and the format of how we're going to go about to achieve our objective today. So even though we do have panelists, but you are as much a very much an integral part of today's discussion. So please feel free to participate. First, I'd like to introduce to you a very distinguished guest, a great friend of the Vietnamese community, and a champion for human rights, and especially in Vietnam. Ambassador Grover Joseph Rees, a former law professor, a judge, a congressional staff, a United States ambassador to East Timor, and United States government official. He has extensive experience in human rights and refugee law and practices. As a BPSOS Senior Counselor for International Initiative, he coordinated the BPSOS team attending the 2014 ASEAN Civil Society Conference and the ASEAN People's Forum held in Burma. Please help me welcome Ambassador Rees. Let me do the rest of the show. I'll bring you up. With us, as well as Mr. Quốc. He is the director of a Germany-based VIDO, Human Rights Defenders Network. He is a graduate of mathematics of the Sciences University Saigon in Vietnam and a computer science of Bremen University in Germany. He joined the human rights movement in 1983 and served in several positions in the International Society for Human Rights from 1993 until 2013. Lastly, as Secretary General, he has provided technical training to scores of advocates in Vietnam and overseas. Please welcome Mr. Quốc. And finally, coming to us from Vietnam via the wonder of technology, Mr. Lý Văn Dũng is a Vietnamese national Hmong ethnicity living in Tuyên Quang province. He was a member of the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Organization, which is affiliated with the Vietnamese Communist Party. Having witnessed the government destruction of the funeral storage shed of the Hmong people, he helped Hmong villagers to draft petitions to the government. Since October of 2013, he joined other Hmong youth who speak Vietnamese in their journey to Hanoi to appeal for the central government's attention. First, I would like to invite Ambassador Rees to come, and sir, you have 10 minutes to speak on the subject of, forgive me for 1 second here, let me find my, of how to obtain a voice in the ASEAN Forum. And I'm sure you have a lot of experience in how to do that. We look forward to hearing from you, Ambassador.
When I I decided to leave the government about 5 years ago after an unintended 25 years of service. I knew that I wanted to work with non-governmental organizations. I knew a few sets of issues that I wanted to work on. And I had to choose between a wide array of refugee organizations, human rights organizations, and other organizations. And so on the refugee and the human rights issues, I chose Both People SOS to ask. I called Dr. Tang a few weeks before I was planning to leave the government and said, you know, could I possibly be a part-time consultant? And I like to think that I could have chosen any number of organizations and that I might have been able to work with them. But the reason that I chose Both People SOS is that in all my years of government, in all the years when I was working in Congress and in the State Department and other agencies, working on human rights issues, on human trafficking, working to save refugees and asylum seekers, there was one organization that no matter when you called them, the day or night, somebody would answer the phone. You know, when I worked in Congress, you had lots of times the votes take place late at night. And I would call one of these bigger organizations and say, hey, somebody on the other side is saying that, you know, 100 refugees that were admitted last year turned out to be terrorists. I don't think that's true, but can you give me the facts? And I would get a voicemail. And the next day they would call after the vote and they would tell me the answer. But Both People SOS, Dr. Tang, and some of the other dedicated people were always there. So when I worked in the government, I used to think that too many non-governmental organizations that we were funding, that we were supporting, were what I call hydroponic NGOs. They were organizations that exist as long as you feed them, and then after that, they don't. And what we wanted, I liked the organizations that keep score, not by how many workshops they hold, but by how many lives they save. And so I am very privileged to have been associated with Boat People SOS for the last 5 years. And one of the first things Dr. Tong asked me to do after I began my counselor relationship was he said, we want you to go to a conference in Cha Am, Thailand, which is a conference of all the different non-governmental organizations in the ASEAN region. ASEAN, of course, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a group of 10 countries, most of them, frankly, without very good governments. But the 10 nations in Southeast Asia, and these non-governmental organizations get together to complain mostly about their own governments, but also to complain about colonialism and imperialism and multinational corporations and all the sorts of things that NGOs complain about. And so I went to the first meeting, and I was impressed with there was a wide range of people, some of them working on environmental issues, some of them working on human rights issues, some of them trying to help the poor, and they had a lot of different perspectives. Well, this was true for 7 countries. For 7 countries in ASEAN, you had a lot of non-governmental organizations with a lot of different perspectives, and they wanted to learn about each other, they wanted to learn about us, why we were there, what we were doing. I went there with a few Vietnamese exiles. I was the only non-Vietnamese on our delegation, but we had a couple of Vietnamese Americans, a couple of recent Vietnamese and Khmer Krom refugees who were still in Thailand. And so we had a delegation of 5 or 6 people. And we found that we could get along with everybody except for 3 countries. In the country of Burma, which the government calls Myanmar, in the country of Vietnam, and in the country of Laos, there were very large delegations. But they were all from organizations that were created by the government. And there's a word for these organizations. They're called GONGOs. Government-organized, non-governmental organizations. There was even one guy who had a badge, and on his badge it said Ministry of Public Security.
Nếu là mới tập dợt người ta đi ăn, người ta chưa có vô hết. Vậy này người ta đi ăn hết rồi, chưa có vô, nên mình chỉ là tập vợ set up thôi, như mình thuộc quy.
Một rưỡi hôm nay có một rưỡi đợi chưa. Vậy là bên này là 12 giờ tiếng. Còn 20 phút nữa thôi. Còn 20 phút nữa thôi. Không, bây giờ anh muốn trực tiếp thì anh cứ việc trực tiếp. Rồi sẽ có chuyện lên thì
tìm được chưa?
Dạ, con Đài sẵn rồi, anh Đài chuẩn bị rồi.
Không còn bên Ninh Đức là mà phòng nào?
Trên Ninh Đức, phòng khác.
Nhưng mà phòng nào không biết.
Còn 2 phòng. Đây.
Phòng 27, 268, 268 cho rồi, 217.
As I read their bios, I invite you to come up to the seat from here. Our distinguished panel includes Congressman Joseph Cao. He is no stranger to the Vietnamese scene here, as he was the first Republican congressional member in Louisiana since the late 1800s. He's also the first Vietnamese American to serve in Congress. He was born in Saigon, Vietnam, and previously worked in law and as well as the seminary. To his right will be Ms. Barbara Haig, who is Deputy to the President for Policy and Strategy at the National Endowment for Democracy. The NED is a private nonprofit foundation dedicated to the growth and strengthening of democratic institutions. In her role, Ms. Haig provides strategic and policy direction to the grant-making efforts of NED and advises the President and Board on institutional strategies to strengthen the goals of these grant programs. With funding from the U.S. Congress, the NED supports more than 1,000 projects of non-governmental groups who are working for democratic goals in over 90 countries, including Vietnam. Previously, she served as Vice President for Program Planning and Evaluation and led the dramatic growth of the NED's grants programs, which included managing program development, monitoring and evaluating the endowment's worldwide grant-making efforts. She has overseen a vast expansion of NED programs in the Arab Middle East, Afghanistan, as well as in South Africa, Central and Eastern Europe. Today we will have a special video conference from someone from Vietnam. Mr. Nguyen Van Dai is a Vietnamese lawyer who is currently under house arrest. He completed law school in Vietnam in 1995, and 2 years later, he ran for a seat in the Communist Party-controlled National Assembly, running unsuccessfully as an independent. Later, Mr. Dai began practicing law as a human rights defender for evangelical churches. He attended many seminars and meetings in the U.S. under the auspices of the U.S. State Department and conferences and workshops worldwide, including in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and other Southeast Asian countries. In 2006, with assistance from the National Endowment for Democracy and BPSOS, Mr. Dai began to train attorneys and law students on human rights projects, which contributed to the establishment of Bloc 8406, a group of prominent human rights advocates. This was instrumental in establishing the Vietnam Human Rights Committee. But because of these activities, he was imprisoned for almost 4 years, from mid-2007 until March 2011. Following his release, he was placed under house arrest, which he continues to this day. Nevertheless, following his release, he founded the Brotherhood for Democracy and helped establish several advocacy organizations, including the Vietnamese Women for Human Rights, the Association of Federal Prisoners of Conscience, and University Students Forum. He will be joining us from video conference, and his interpreter is Mr. Nguyen Dinh Dien. Please help me welcome all the guests. And now I'd like to invite Ms. Barbara Hay to come to the podium.
Hello, thank you, Cindy. And I'm just really honored and thrilled to be here with all of you and very impressed at how much this meeting has expanded over the years. Obviously, the Vietnam community is extremely committed and entrepreneurial, as we know. I'm not an expert on Vietnam, so I was asked basically if I would spotlight for you and maybe get you thinking a little bit about approaches in your home country of Vietnam, of what I've seen, some of the lessons that I've learned from transitions or political openings, political change in other countries around the world. And I think, you know, as you can imagine, and if you really thought about it, all transitions and political openings are very, very different from country to country, and they have a very different basis for what triggers them. And you don't even always know when you're witnessing maybe dramatic events, whether they're actually going to lead to democratization or even something more negative than what preceded them. So one has to look at a long period of time to determine what was the moment, what were the key moments, what caused them, and where did they really take us. I'll bring up one example that came to mind in talking with some young people from Vietnam who, as so many young people are today, were very tech savvy and had been doing a lot of research and watching social media and watching the Arab uprisings, reading what they could. And there were a few of them that brought up the issue of an organization and the transition that happened in Serbia several years back now. And they had this idea that all of these political openings and changes were simply instant episodes which were based on mobilizing people out in the streets using social media or whatever means of organizing to use nonviolent protest, that this is what had brought about change in many of these countries. And they were very surprised at my reaction when I said, look, the students who went out in Serbia and mobilized people did so at a particular moment when they knew that an election was going to be stolen. But there were actually decades of work that went beforehand, involving all sorts of people and sectors and strategies. They weren't aware that in a place like Serbia had political pluralism, though very repressed. So they had opposition political parties. Those political parties came together in coalitions. They had won a decade before the transition. They had won municipal elections that gave them control over municipal radio stations and so on. There were independent workers organizations, trade unions. In the case of Serbia, not so much the churches, but in many other countries, the churches were really critical spaces where people learned, particularly human rights, but also social values, how to work in their communities, how to reach out and tap into the society at large. So in a place like Serbia, there were human rights groups. The place had been at war, so that was an unusual factor that they didn't really think about. So then we turned to a place like Egypt, much more recent, where social media really seemed to drive what happened. But what happened there? A lot of young people using social media mistook their international popularity and what they were saying to each other as having support in the rural areas across the country, which of course was not the case because they had never really been experienced in going out and building relationships in other communities. They were in their own subculture. They didn't reach out more broadly, and they had no way to to cooperate with other groups across the country, and so they lost a lot of ground. Anyway, I'm gonna wind up my initial comments for the moment so that we can talk a little bit more and think about what are the sorts of things that are done in closed societies like Vietnam.
I'd like to remind everybody that there will be a question and answer session after all the panelists speak. So please reserve your good questions for the end. I will also write down any recommendations that come out of this working group and the panelists, and we'll present them tonight at the working dinner. Dạ thưa quý vị, sau khi những người đại biểu nói chuyện xong, sẽ có thì giờ sau đó để quý vị trong phòng họp này và những ai trên internet có thể đặt câu hỏi. I'd like to invite Congressman Cao to speak.
Lúc mà chúng ta nói về một xã hội công bằng và cái xã hội đó nó mang tới những sự thay đổi cho tự do, thì chúng ta, những vấn đề đầu tiên chúng ta phải cần hỏi là một cái xã hội đó phải cần có những cái hệ thống gì. Nếu mà chúng ta sống ở trong xã hội này thì chúng ta thấy rất là rõ ràng là trong một cái xã hội công bằng, thứ nhất là chúng ta phải cần có cái hiến pháp để điều khiển những cái luật lệ và tất cả những cái sự điều khiển xã hội của mình. Và cái hiến pháp đó nó sẽ bắt buộc những cái cơ quan giống như là Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ hay là Tòa Bạch Ốc phải cần làm việc theo. Và nếu Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ hay là Tòa Bạch Ốc vô làm việc theo thì chúng ta có thể dựa vô cái hệ thống luật pháp để chúng ta lên tiếng hay là chúng ta đòi hỏi họ phải cần dựa theo. Nếu chúng ta so sánh xã hội của Mỹ cùng với lại xã hội của Việt Nam thì chúng ta thấy rõ ràng là thứ nhất, cái hiến pháp, cái gọi là cái spirit of the law nó không có ở đó. Mặc dù Việt Nam có trình bày là chúng tôi có cái hiến.
Thank you for this great opportunity to inform you of the status of civil society in Vietnam. Following are the points that I would like to draw your attention to. Vietnam's government has not recognized any independent civil society organization or authorized any such organization to operate. The Vietnam has established organizations that they characterize as civil society organizations. In fact, these government-created organizations serve to further the party's goal of controlling the people because they are the extension of the Communist Party and its national government apparatus. The government assigns its official or a retired Communist Party member to leadership and managerial position in major government-sponsored organizations such as labor unions, youth associations, university student organizations, veterans group, activists. Its government-controlled civil society organizations are accorded legal entity status. Financial support by the government for these organizations is significant, covering offices and facilities and transportation and all other operating expenses. These organizations have central headquarters and branch offices, are highly managed and controlled, and have well-trained officers and staff. The government created this civil society organization not only to squeeze out civil space in Vietnam, but also to send their representatives to regional and international forums to receive international donors into believing that Vietnam has independent civil society organizations. As a result, these civil society organizations capture most of the funding for civil society development and grow in capacity to further sideline the real civil society organization. No independent civil society organization is allowed to operate legally in Vietnam. In the past few years, independent citizen organizations with and without legal entity status have increasingly played the role of de facto civil society organization by responding to the people's rising aspiration for human rights. The number of them are actively promoting awareness about protection and advocacy for democracy and human rights. More recently, individual citizens have formed many civil society organizations aimed at mobilizing the people's patriotism in the face of China's territorial aggression. Others founded civil society organizations to advocate for human rights and democracy, such as Grassroots for Democracy, Vietnam Workers Network, Civil Society Forum, Association of Land Expropriation Victims, Vietnamese Women for Human Rights, Association of Former Prisoners and Persons. In addition, university students have formed approximately 100 clubs focusing on humanitarian goals such as healthcare and other assistance for the poor. Nearly all civil society organizations with humanitarian or human rights objectives operate in town and cities in the urban areas. Towns in the rural and highlands have very few such organizations. The fathers of civil society organizations are typically young and educated people or university students. They are overwhelmingly opposed to the communist one-party rule and aspire to establish a free and democratic system. They desire for Vietnam to keep a closer relationship with their United States, Japan, Australia, and democratic countries in the European Union and Asia Pacific region as a counterweight to Vietnam's neighbor, China. The government has not issued an operating permit to any civil society organizations established by independent citizens organizations and private citizens. They do not have the protection of the law because the government does not consider them legal entities. They have no office or even a bank account and lack funding and other resources to operate. They raise funds here and there and operate underground, aiming to stay outside of the government oversight. Their membership is small and lacking in experience. Independent organizations have no chance to gain domestic or international exposure and establish contact with their peers outside of Vietnam and are absent from regional and international forums. The government will harass and punish members of those independent organizations that join such forums. The government security agency and other agencies have been targeting independent civil society organizations as soon as they discover their existence. These civil society organizations clearly face innumerable obstacles as they operate under the constant threat of harassment and detention of their members. As soon as the government knows about the existence of an independent organization, its agents would monitor the organization's members, prevent them from gathering for meeting or traveling abroad, and confiscate their telephones, computers, fax machines, and other office equipment necessary to their operation. Furthermore, the government constantly creates problems for members' livelihood through pressuring their employers or customers into taking adverse actions with respect to the members. Government agents have raided members' homes and confiscated computers, cell phones, and other equipment, or pressured landlords into not renewing these contracts with with strong financial and political support from free government and international community, independent civil society organization in Vietnam will soon make contribution to awareness, defense, and advocacy for democracy and human rights in Vietnam. Their activity will facilitate the democratization of Vietnam and its integration into the international community and allow Vietnam to play a role in peace and stability in the Asian Pacific region as a partner with the other nations in the region. Speaking for the genuine civil society organization in Vietnam that have so far lacked a voice at international forums, I urge the United States Congress to create opportunities for United States government.
I'd like to open up the floor for questions, particularly for the panelists here today, and also to luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đài. There will be an interpreter as well. Dạ, xin quý vị nếu có câu hỏi thì đưa tay lên. Mời chị ra.
Cái mở microphone.
Vâng, đây là Nguyễn Thị Ngọc Giao của Tiếng Nói Tình Mỹ Gốc Việt. Xin được kính chào luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đài. Ngọc Giao xin được nói bằng tiếng Việt và sau đó nếu có thông dịch viên thì xin cảm ơn, nếu không thì Ngọc Giao sẽ cố gắng nói lại bằng tiếng Anh. Thứ nhất xin được nói chuyện với quý đồng hương Việt Nam đang theo dõi chương trình này vì Ngọc Giao nghĩ là phần này rất quan trọng cho tất cả những người đang chú tâm đến xã hội dân sự tại Việt Nam. Thứ nhất xin được chúc mừng luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đài và tất cả những nỗ lực của anh và khối 8406 cùng sự thành lập của rất nhiều xã hội dân sự tại Việt Nam ngày hôm nay. Xin anh cho biết ngay lúc này vấn đề nào là vấn đề quan trọng nhất đối với xã hội dân sự tại Việt Nam và chúng tôi, những người Mỹ gốc Việt, có thể làm được điều gì để thay đổi điều đó một cách tích cực và giúp cho xã hội dân sự Việt Nam có thể hoạt động mạnh mẽ hơn. Trong điều này xin được hỏi luật sư dân biểu Cao Quang Ánh và bà xin đi nói lại tên của bà Barbara Hệ về cái tình trạng làm sao để có thể tài trợ tài chính cho những xã hội dân sự tại Việt Nam một cách hợp pháp. I like to just translate it back in English. I have said congratulations to lawyer Nguyễn Văn Đài for all his achievements and the newly established civil societies in Vietnam. So my question to lawyer Nguyễn Văn Đài was what is the main obstacle right now that preventing the development of the civil societies in Vietnam. What luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đài and the civil societies in Vietnam think we, the Vietnamese Americans, and the U.S. Congress can help to remove that obstacle and support them. And the question to you, Ms. Barbara, what would you advise for the civil societies in Vietnam to gain funding and financial support legally?
Tiếp theo ngắn gọn này, tức là thứ nhất là các tổ chức doanh nghiệp Việt Nam cần cái sự công nhận từ chính phủ Việt Nam cũng như là từ cộng đồng quốc tế. Em nói thêm không?
It's so difficult for these civil service organizations within the to get independent systems. They need first the recognition, to be recognized by the international community, so that they can receive assistance legally. Also, the foreign embassies in Vietnam need to recognize the existence of these legitimate civil society organizations. So he hopes that we will work with the Vietnamese government to recognize them as legal entities, as legitimate civil society organizations also.
Vâng, thì xin trả lời câu hỏi phần thứ hai đó là cộng đồng người Việt ở hải ngoại thì có thể làm gì cho các cái tổ chức xã hội dân sự ở Việt Nam thì để được các cái tổ chức quốc tế cũng như chính phủ nước công nhận các cái tổ chức dân sự Việt Nam thì cái nhiệm vụ vận động của cộng đồng người Việt hải ngoại đóng vai trò rất là quan trọng. Ví dụ cái buổi hôm nay đó thì cộng đồng người Việt hải ngoại đã tổ chức rất là tốt để cho chính giới Mỹ biết về các cái tổ chức xã hội dân sự ở Việt Nam. Và cái thứ hai cộng đồng người Việt có thể làm được đó là cần đóng góp ủng hộ và tài chính để có thể nuôi sống những cái tổ chức xã hội dân sự mới được thành lập ở Việt Nam.
So the third question is that the Vietnamese communities abroad, such as the Vietnamese American community here, we should work hard to let the existence of these CSOs known, and then we also need to find financial systems to support until we are able to spend our own.
Now I'd like to invite Ms. Barbara Hayes. The question was, how do you advise civil society organizations in Vietnam to get funding and financial support for their work?
First of all, I'll be brief because I think what part of my answer to you has just been answered, which is that organizations such as MOM that are in touch through people like you, we are in touch with who are some of the real, if you want to call them civil society organizations, who really represent civil society inside Vietnam and try to provide more and more platforms and avenues for addressing international bodies of donors. This includes, for instance, there is a new special rapporteur, 3 years old, at the Human Rights Council of the UN, whose mission is to report on and negotiate with governments on freedom of peaceful assembly and association. In the course of doing this, we have worked with him a great deal, along with a couple of core groups. He's provided some reports to the Human Rights Council, which supports the right of civil society organizations and political organizations, but civil society organizations broadly speaking, to seek, access, and utilize foreign funding. So this is one way. We will keep advocating for this. We will work with this special rapporteur.
Trong cái bộ phận này và cái việc làm của chúng ta gồm có những vấn đề gì? Những người trên biểu hôm nay họ nói rất là đúng là họ không có biết được những cái sự tiến triển ở nước Việt, những cái vấn đề đang xảy ra ở trong nước Việt, cho nên họ cần những người trong cộng đồng chúng ta thường xuyên nói chuyện với họ, nhắc họ trình bày với họ về những cái vấn đề đang xảy ra trong nước Việt để cho họ biết và họ lên tiếng. Và qua cái sự lên tiếng đó thì chắc chắn họ sẽ ảnh hưởng tới những cái vấn đề làm việc của Bộ Ngoại giao hay là Tòa Bạch Ốc đối với nước Việt Nam về cái chương trình xuyên Thái Bình Dương chẳng hạn, TPP. Một trong những cái điều kiện của chương trình TPP là Việt Nam phải cần có một cái hệ thống luật pháp để bảo vệ cho người lao động. Đó là một cái đòi hỏi của cái chương trình đó. Và qua cái tiếng nói của cộng đồng của chúng ta, qua cái áp lực của cộng đồng của chúng ta thì chắc chắn những người dân Việt và nhân sĩ của mình có thể buộc Tòa Bạch Ốc là không có cho Việt Nam tham gia vào chương trình này nếu mà Việt Nam chưa có đầy đủ thành lập một cái hệ thống luật pháp để bảo vệ cho những người lao động. Đó là một trong những việc làm mà...
Dạ thưa mục sư, tôi tên là Trinh. Tôi có một câu hỏi sau khi mà nghe mục sư trình bày những cái bắt bớ, những khó khăn trong cái công việc mà thờ phượng của mục sư và những tín đồ Tin Lành. Thì câu hỏi của tôi như thế này: mục sư nói là các hội thánh Tin Lành, những hội thánh Tin Lành lớn ở Việt Nam đa số là những hội thánh Tin Lành quốc danh. Thì nói như vậy có nghĩa là những hội thánh hoặc là chẳng hạn như mục sư đang practice, mục sư đang thờ phượng theo hệ phái CMA là Phúc Âm Liên Hiệp á, theo hệ phái CMA là Phúc Âm Liên Hiệp.
These violations to law enforcement. We can echo the voices of the victim, of course. We can ask the Congress members to adapt, making a number of priesthood of conscience. We can also work with the diplomatic mission of the Western countries, cultivate a relationship with them, and we can also somehow educate the victims themselves or their families or their friends to write a report and publish it themselves. Just make it
mục sư con ở đó.
Con đang ở đây nhưng mà tôi không nghe được anh câu hỏi là rất là nhiều.
Dạ, thưa mục sư, tôi có câu hỏi như thế này. Mục sư nói là mục sư đang ở Việt Nam và đang trong sinh hoạt thờ phượng Chúa trong cái hệ phái Phúc Âm Liên Hiệp, phải không ạ? Thì trong hệ phái đó, theo tôi được biết là ở Việt Nam có một cái giáo hội, tức là mỗi tôn giáo có cái giáo hội, chẳng hạn như giáo hội của Phúc Âm Liên Hiệp thì cũng rất là tương đối lớn. Thì nói như vậy có nghĩa là trong cái hệ phái Phúc Âm Liên Hiệp đó được sinh hoạt như vậy thì không biết có bị bắt bớ hay là đó cũng được coi là một hệ phái của thờ phượng tôn giáo mà quốc danh.
Dạ, câu hỏi rất là có thể nói lên cái vấn đề câu hỏi nhưng mà mình chỉ có thể thưa với quý vị rằng ở Việt Nam thì tất cả các hệ phái Tin Lành thì đều có những cái hội thánh nhánh hay là các cái hội thánh nhóm ở các cái gia đình tư nhân đấy, mà vì cái lý do là không có nhà thờ, cộng sản họ không có cho xây dựng nhà thờ, và các hội thánh tư gia nhóm ở trong các gia đình nhà dân đấy thì đều gặp rất là nhiều khó khăn vì bắt bớ và giải phóng các cái vụ thờ phượng. Không riêng thì người sắc tộc mà cả những người Kinh, chúng tôi cũng vậy. Và hiện tại đấy thì tôi đang gặp cái khó khăn là tôi bị quản chế và bị quản lý tại địa phương, cho nên cái việc đi giảng dạy cũng rất là khó khăn. Hiện tại không có cái cơ hội để đi đến cái vùng xa và tiếp cận với mọi người, cho nên rất là khó khăn để tiếp cận thông tin. Mà tôi hy vọng rằng câu hỏi sau nữa thì tôi sẽ nghe được rõ hơn, thì cái này không có nghe được hết câu hỏi.
Dạ, cảm ơn một sự
nhiều cái sự phức tạp cho những ban tổ chức hay là những người tụ họp ở trong xã hội Việt Nam chúng ta. Cho nên nếu mà chúng ta so sánh từ xã hội dân sự với lại xã hội công dân, nó đi song với nhau và cái lý tưởng nó cũng giống hệt như nhau. Cái đó là chúng ta phải gồm có những vấn đề gì, là cái sự tự do cho dân chúng có quyền điều khiển cái đời sống của mình, cho dân chúng có quyền nắm vững và lên tiếng những vấn đề gì mà dân chúng không có đồng ý nữa.
time for one or two more questions from the audience. If not, I have a question of my own. For Ms. Barbara Hay, your work with NED spans several different countries, including those that don't recognize freedoms that the U.S. does. How does your organization work in those countries when there's a lack of freedom?
Sure, thank you. It's interesting because the NED is actually a funded program in what we commonly refer to as closed society, politically not free. Since the beginning of our existence, which is about 1984, we started funding programs. So we're rather specialized in this. So first of all, it's important to understand that NED does not open offices in the countries where we fund the program. We work, our headquarters is Washington, our field staff is Washington. We travel quite a bit. We typically, in a closed society where groups can register legally, often if they're really, not state-created groups, we typically would provide funding through an outside organization. The reason for this is to protect the amount of direct documentation and information that we keep at NED, because we are very transparent and we're under the Freedom of Information Act. So if we have one step removed, we can bring in auditors, we can look at the documentation, but keep it safely out of the hands of anybody who asks for it. We have all sorts of techniques for getting resources into countries, but often in these kinds of environments, you could be talking about very small amounts of funding, and like I mentioned, sometimes it's just a matter of, getting people some stipends which they can then use. It will take a local bus to their next community so that they can have an organizing discussion or work on some social program. But we are able to fund, groups that don't have legal recognition in their own country.
And how do groups find out more about your organization's funding?
Well, we have on our website, which is www.ned.org, there is a section called Grants. Isn't that where where's the application information? For a grant seeker, you click on there. You don't have a form that you have to fill out. You can send it by paper, a proposal, or you can send it electronically. I don't think we have a Vietnamese speaker on staff, but we have most languages on staff. So it would be helpful probably to have it in French or English or some other Spanish.
Meaning after this program, you'll have a Vietnamese speaker on staff in case it needs more applications come in from Vietnam. Thank you. Dạ thưa quý vị, có ai muốn đặt câu hỏi không cho luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đại hoặc là những người trong này? Any more questions? We have one quick comment.
Tại Ngọc Giao của Tiếng Nói Người Mỹ gốc Việt xin hỏi luật sư Đài một câu nữa là hầu như tất cả mọi người Việt trong nước hiện nay đều rất quan tâm đến sự kế hoạch xâm lăng của Trung Cộng, và rất nhiều người khi đi biểu tình thì đã bị đàn áp, thậm chí bị bắt và bị giam. Những người như luật sư như anh Nguyễn Tiến Trung hiện giờ vẫn còn đang bị giam giữ, và anh Điếu Cày vẫn còn bị giam giữ chỉ vì đã biểu tình chống sự xâm lăng của Trung Cộng. Luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đài nghĩ thế nào về vấn đề này, và hiện thời chính quyền Cộng sản Việt Nam có cho phép người dân bày tỏ cái sự phản đối về thái độ của Trung Cộng đối với người Việt hay không?
Xin mời luật sư Nguyễn Văn Đài.
Trên thực tiễn thì họ đã sử dụng một cái nghị định của chính phủ là nghị định 38 để hạn chế, thậm chí là bóp chết cái quyền biểu tình của người dân. Cho nên là tất cả các biểu tình của người dân Việt Việt Nam thì chính quyền đều coi là bất hợp pháp. Thế thì việc trong năm vừa qua có diễn ra được một số vụ biểu tình thì nó là bởi do cái sự áp lực từ cộng đồng quốc tế cũng như là cái sự dũng cảm của người dân thôi. Chứ còn về mặt chính quyền thì họ hoàn toàn không bao giờ muốn cái cuộc biểu tình đó xảy ra đâu.
Có sao nói không?
The interpreter.
Dr. Dai's answer to the question that the question was what was the government position with respect to young people demonstrating against China's territorial aggression against Vietnam? His answer is as follows. The Vietnamese government really wants to prevent such demonstration.
English cho bài Anh là ai để cho tất cả chúng ta.
May I ask, why arrested me? What have I done wrong? May I ask, who are you? Why beat me with that and apply his custom? May I ask, who are you? To keep me from speaking out, from protesting.
Yêu quê hương này, dân tộc này đã quá nhiều đắng cay. Rồi.
May I ask, where are you? Forbidding me from opposing a Chinese invasion. May I ask, where are you? Why stole me in the language of my people? Where is your nationalism? Why constantly take orders from China?
Bàn tay nào nhuộm đầy máu đồng bào. Việt Nam đang ngã nghiêng, dân tộc tôi phải chịu đắm chìm một nhà.
Into 1,000 years of internal darkness. I cannot sit still. My children and the next generation deserve a future.
Vietnam has signed the Convention Against Torture. That's a UN convention. It has no enforcement mechanisms. It's very important, but it has no enforcement. But what does have enforcement mechanisms is a sister treaty called Optional Protocol for Convention Against Torture, or OPCAT. And that treaty, we should certainly push for Vietnam to sign and ratify immediately, because it calls for international and domestic monitors to be able to go into the prisons and detention centers and mental hospitals to monitor the situation of torture and prison conditions, have the right to go in anytime unannounced and to monitor conditions. And this would be a great asset in the fight against torture, because one of the most effective ways to prevent torture is through monitoring, and experts have established that. So when you have a system that's basically closed, nobody can get in, it facilitates torture. Police can beat somebody up behind those doors, and they also know that no one else will know. So you need to get that access, and one way to do that is for the communities to call for Vietnam to abide by the Convention Against Torture, but also to sign and ratify OPCAT, that's the sister treaty. When we talk about sort of next steps, you have your information, and you have sort of an advocacy plan, who you're going to try to influence Vietnam. Then you also need to think about how to keep your information up to date. How are you going to monitor what's happening this week in Vietnam? This report was published in January. It's very, very difficult, as you all know so well.
to monitor conditions in a closed country, a country that's closed to human rights, monitors. People in Vietnam who defend human rights can go to jail, and people outside have very difficult time getting access. So I think what is important is to get people who are on the ground in Vietnam now who can provide information about conditions, but to keep in mind a very serious dilemma. When we are asking people in Vietnam for information, even through the video or something, we have to be responsible in a sense that they know what they're getting into when they give us information. On March 10th, 2 Montagnards in my province were sentenced to 8 and 9 years in prison. One of the reasons they were going to prison, they had tried to collect information about Montagnards in prison and send it out. Did they know they could go to prison for doing this? I don't know. So it's our responsibility, if we ask for information from groups inside, that we not put them in danger without them knowing it, and also that they have clear knowledge of the risk that's involved. I would end by just saying that, in such a campaign, we would really need the participation of survivors of torture, former political and religious prisoners. That is a true voice that people will listen to. But at the same time, we have to protect the people, the survivors and the prisoners from not being once again made into victims of torture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker. Is former Ambassador Joseph Reese. He is a former law professor, a judge, congressional staff, United States Ambassador to East Timor, and United States government official. He has extensive experience in human rights and refugee law and practices. As PPS's Senior Consular Advisor for International Initiative, he coordinated the PPSOS team attending the 2014 Asian Civil Society Conferences in the Asian People's Forum held in Burma, and he just returned from Burma this week. Thank you to him.
I'm honored to be able to speak, and I'm happy to speak whenever you want me to, but I know that we have this young woman in Vietnam who's been waiting to speak, and I'm wondering if it wouldn't be better to have her first. No, I don't see her anymore.
We took a 5-minute break. She's waiting too long.
She's waiting too long. We'll take a 5-minute break.
She's waiting 3-4 hours. Yes. Remember, it's about 6 o'clock in the morning.
Right, so.
Start her to be or?
No, she took a break. 5 minutes. So why don't you?
To take a break.
Yeah, why don't you just start with him?
So I someone else.
Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers for this opportunity, and I'm a little sad because I came here expecting to hear Congressman Wolf, who one of the great heroes, one of the great human rights advocates and defenders in the United States Congress for many years now, and I guess he's been called to votes, and he did speak earlier to the plenary about the situation of religion and religious organizations in Vietnam. Because he unexpectedly can't make it, I've been asked to fill in for him, and those are very big shoes to fill. I will do my best. The situation of religion in Vietnam that as with many other rights, fundamental human rights, the government of Vietnam claims, though, is also still detained by the Vietnamese government. And yet, they say that there's freedom of religion. If you want to visit a pagoda in Vietnam, you can visit a great, big, successful, prosperous-looking pagoda, but it's all staffed by monks who are reporting to a government committee. They no longer report to the religious authorities that supervised them before. Instead, they are working for a government committee. Probably the second largest denomination in Vietnam is the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was treated differently. Unlike the Chinese government, which abolished the Catholic Church and founded its own patriotic Catholic Church, the Vietnamese government allowed the Catholic Church to continue to exist. But they said, from now on, the affairs of the Catholic Church will be directed by a government-organized committee called the Committee of Priests. And as you would expect, the priests who were on this committee were priests who were sympathetic to Marxism, which of course is difficult because if you're a Catholic, you're supposed to believe in God. And if you're a communist, you're not supposed to believe in God. So that creates some tensions. But there were some priests, or at least some nominal Catholic priests, who were communists. And those priests were put on this committee of priests. And that committee tried to direct the affairs of the Catholic Church. The Vietnamese government doesn't allow the consecration of new bishops unless they themselves designate who those bishops are going to be for the Catholic Church. Who are members of ethnic minorities. So they're in double trouble. They're in trouble because they're Christians and because they are loyal to God and they are loyal to their faith, and that loyalty is more important to them than their loyalty to the government. And that always gets you in trouble. But they're also in trouble because they're members of ethnic minority groups. And unfortunately, some people, including our own government, who focus on freedom of religion, have said, oh, the situation of the evangelical Protestants has improved a lot because so many of them are being allowed to register with the government. Well, if you register your church with the government, you're promising the government that none of your members are going to ever demonstrate against the government, for one thing. You're making a lot of promises, and a lot of these evangelicals cannot keep those promises, so they don't want to register with the government. They do not want to be controlled by a committee of atheists. They want to be able to worship in their homes, to worship in their churches, and they are being denied that right. When they exercise that right, they are being arrested, they are being imprisoned, they are being tortured. That is the reality of religion in Vietnam. And those of us who have the privilege of practicing our own religions in the United States, we need to bear witness, we need to stand with our brother and sister believers in Vietnam, and we need to tell the truth. Thank you.
Xin cảm ơn cựu đại sứ Joseph Rees. Ông ta là cựu đại sứ của Mỹ tại nước Đông Timor, và ông ta vừa mới trở về từ Burma để dự đại hội của Asian xã hội dân sự tại Burma. Và người kế tiếp chúng tôi muốn giới thiệu đó là cô Phần Thuộc Vi. Chắc có lẽ mọi người đây đều rất là quen biết với cô ta trong các blogger. Phần Thuộc Vi graduated with a law degree but has dedicated her time writing many articles on political and human rights issues as a blogger. She is a co-founder of the Vietnamese Women for Human Rights, a recently founded civil society organization that defends the rights of women in Vietnam. She was a recipient of the Human Rights Watch Helmut Hammett Award in 2012 and the Human Rights Award from the Vietnam Human Rights Network also in 2012. She and her families are targets of ongoing government persecution. Xin quý vị theo dõi phần phát biểu của cô Huỳnh Thuộc Vi.
Chúng ta cùng chào đón người bạn
Thuộc Vi, người đã từng tranh đấu cho nhân quyền ở tại Việt Nam, một người bạn trẻ. Hôm nay hiện diện trong cái buổi điều trần về nhân quyền ở tại Quốc hội Hoa Kỳ. Chúng tôi hân hoan chào đón Huỳnh Thuộc Vi. Xin mời. Và chúng ta thấy một bức hình của một cô gái ở bên dưới Huỳnh Thuộc Vi. Đấy là Hồng Nhiên, một người sinh hoạt ở trên hệ thống cao tốc toàn cầu để đưa cái buổi điều trần của chúng ta đến hàng ngàn người đang theo dõi ở trên toàn thế giới, và đặc biệt đến với các bạn trẻ đang sinh hoạt và đang theo dõi chương trình này ở tại Việt Nam. Xin cho cô đó một tràng pháo tay, cô Hồng Nhiên.
Dear honorable guests, fellow advocates for human rights, ladies and gentlemen, so far, I've been quite surprised to see that, despite many international NGOs that defend women's rights coming to Vietnam every year to discuss and collaborate with the Vietnam Women's Union to battle against issues such as domestic violence, trafficking of women and children, sex slavery, etc. The infringement of the rights of women continues, with the situation deteriorating day by day. The Vietnamese government will send human traffickers, deceiving Vietnamese workers into accepting highly abusive and exploitative overseas work contracts. And when actual and cruel labor exploitation takes place, the government simply turns a blind eye. Cases of human trafficking for sexual slavery are similar. Although victims have turned to the Vietnamese embassies in the host countries, they are not helped. In fact, a Vietnamese embassy even held the brothel owners who capture the victims. Ironically, when the government continues to claim to protect women, women continue to be trampled upon. Simply said, most international NGOs do not have deep insight into the nature and operating structure of the political system in Vietnam. Here, the legal and police systems are tools used to spread distance, not to protect victims of oppression. Even when crimes take place in this country, only money and relationships with influential people decide the verdicts of trial, not evidences from the scene or principles of justice. Vietnam Women's Union is a larger umbrella organization for the Vietnam Bloodland Dog. The Vietnam Communist Movement and assemble all citizens. It is like that is country registry for
Subject of retaliatory acts of violence by the hands of the dictatorship, and with Vietnamese women remaining as the most vulnerable demographic. Vietnamese Women for Human Rights was established on November 25th, 2013 as one of the founders of this association and as a blogger who has observed the ruling system and human rights situation in Vietnam, I'm aware of the need for the existence of such an association. And if we succeed, despite the increasingly brutal crackdown by the authorities in the future, we will assume the role of opposition to the authoritarian government's Vietnam Women's Union. We believe that the establishment of Vietnamese Women for Human Rights was really needed too.
And as a blogger who has observed the ruling system and the human rights situation in Vietnam, I am aware of the need for the existence of such an association. And if Vietnamese Women for Human Rights is successful even in the face of the increasingly brutal crackdown from the authorities, we will be achieving what the Vietnam Women's Union claims to do, but has never done and will never do. Truly representing and defending the rights of all Vietnamese women. We believe that the establishment of Vietnamese Women for Human Rights will really needed to independently, fairly, and without profit represent women that have been, are, and will be violated their human rights. All of our activities are carried out with the goals to connect with and help disadvantaged women who are vulnerable to violation of human rights. Speak up for and take practical action to protect women who have had their fundamental human rights and dignity infringed upon. Share knowledge to improve Vietnamese women's understanding of their human rights and of the role of women in a society that respects women and human rights. To us, there is nothing more important than raising awareness of each individual in society about human dignity and human rights. Because we think that it is only when people know of these values do they become determined to protect them. Making sure the news about human rights violations will not be blacked out, neglect, and the lack of sunshine in these matters makes them worse. And creating a trustworthy cyberspace for Vietnamese women, thereby contributing to promote a society that is democratic, that follows the rule of law, and that respects human rights. Vietnamese Women for Human Rights is committed from the outset as an apolitical civil society organization, committed to contribute its role in the endeavor to construct a Vietnamese society that respects human rights and is an integral part of the movement to protect women's rights around the world. We have several great things going for us. First, all over the world, women's rights now have captured popular attention and become one of the highest priorities. The overwhelming support we receive from Vietnamese all over the country and the world, and from other human rights activists reflects the priorities. Secondly, women always suffer much more disadvantages than men due to social circumstances and the Vietnamese culture. So, when we the right time to answer a crying need. We have earned a good reputation among the community of human rights activists. Thus, we hope that we will be able to recruit more members, remain operational for a long time, and contribute to changing the course of our country's history for the better. However, it is not that there are no difficulties. First, we have been victims of a smear campaign from a splitting of public opinion shapers that we are a satellite of an overseas political party that is considered a terrorist organization by the state of Vietnam. Secondly, using our public membership list, local security forces come to our members' home and threaten them to leave the group. The regime fears the assembly of human rights activists into an organization. The greater this fear, the more they target and viciously oppress us, especially the members of the board of directors who are monitored regularly. Finally, it is the very crackdown by the state that creates another challenge for us. For being afraid of the governmental harassment, many of our members hesitate to gather and participate in our public activities. We have been in operation for only a few months. However, we have some considerable experiences to share with activists who are trying to connect into a civil association. In my opinion, the most important thing that an activist group should have is a good nucleus, that is, leading members of the group must work closely together to form the core of the group. And this core must be effective, having organizational knowledge, maintaining relationships with the media and other groups, and possessing the willingness to work together in a spirit of personal responsibility. On behalf of the group, Vietnamese Women for Human Rights, I am extremely honored to share my thoughts with you today. Your support in our inception and in the future definitely help us fulfill our commitment as possible. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we have 20 minutes for questioning any of the panelists. Và sau đây là 2 phút chúng ta có thể hỏi những vị diễn giả ngày hôm nay.
Xin cảm ơn.
Vậy thôi.
Và mong cái hội của Thuật Vi càng ngày càng thành công. Câu hỏi này xin được dành cho cả 3 người tham luận đoàn trong tham luận đoàn. Ambassador Rees, it's an honor to have you here, and especially that you just got back from Burma. So I'd like to have your advice regarding the difference between Burma and Vietnam, and how we can narrow the gap. And also for Sarah, thank you for your experience. Vietnam has recently signed the CAP, and you have pointed out that there's no enforcement. So is there anything that you can suggest that we can oversight, you can enforce? And for Hung Pin, she herself has suffered torturing, right? You have suffered a lot of abuses while she was under the detention, and including, I would say, sexual abuse a little bit. So I respect Queen Thục Vi, and I would hope that Queen Thục Vi can be stronger to lead other women in Vietnam. How can we help you, Queen Thục Vi, to build up the association, the organization, the coalition of Vietnamese women? Thank you.
Well, first, I know that I speak for everybody here, and everything she said, you know, I haven't had the benefit of living in Vietnam and seeing things from her perspective, and yet everything she said just struck me as so powerful and so true. So thank you. Thank you very, very much. As far as the difference between Burma and Vietnam, listen, Burma still has a long way to go. They do not have a real democracy in Burma. They still have a constitution that says that even if the democratic forces won every single seat in parliament that was open for election, there would still be 25% of the seats guaranteed to the military. And you can't change the constitution without more than that many votes. So they have a constitution that's fundamentally an undemocratic constitution. It's great that they let Aung San Suu Kyi out of jail. It's great that they released almost all of the other prisoners of conscience, but they still do have some political prisoners, and they arrested some new ones not long ago. So they were having to be in exile until a year or two ago. And now they're allowed to speak. They have a free press in Burma. There's still some self-censorship, but now it's more like it was in Indonesia under the days of Suharto, where the elections left a lot to be desired, the government left a lot to be desired, but at least you were allowed to criticize the government, and you were allowed to have an organization that was providing help to people who were against the government. In Vietnam, as Nguyen Thuc Vi has said, they have fake organizations that are pretending to help people, but that are really arms of the government. And if you start your own real non-governmental organization, if you tried to start a newspaper, we saw what happened to Yu Kai when he founded the Club of Free Journalists. He is now in jail. And so the problem is that for exercising your basic rights in Vietnam, you still go to jail. That no longer happens, or at least it's not happening very much now in Burma. So Vietnam has seized the mantle of being the biggest human rights violator in Southeast Asia, and we need to remind people of that. Thank you.
Vietnam is the biggest human rights violator in Asia, and probably has the most prisoners of conscience. And the challenge for us is to make this known. Because people just don't know that Vietnam is abusing human rights to this degree. It may, we in this room may know that it has hundreds and hundreds of political and religious prisoners, but outside of this room, most people, they do not know. So that's the challenge, I think, for our group. In regard to the Convention Against Torture, when I said it didn't have any enforcement mechanisms or powers in it. Most UN treaties, they, to some degree, lack teeth or lack enforcement mechanisms. But what's special about CAT, Convention Against Torture, is that there is this sister convention or protocol. It's called OPCAT, Optional Protocol for CAT, which does have very specific practical things that the signatory has to do. And so in the case of Vietnam, we should push for Vietnam.
Dạ vâng, xin mời.
Tôi muốn có câu hỏi cho cô Huỳnh Thục Vi, đó là những người phụ nữ hiện đang sống ở các nước tự do trên thế giới có thể tham gia làm thành viên của Hội Phụ nữ Việt Nam Nhân Quyền hay là không?
Người ở trên thế giới, người trên thế giới ngoài Việt Nam, ngoài
chúng tôi đó là Vietnamese Women for Human Rights, thì những người phụ nữ mà là thành viên của chúng tôi phải là người gốc từ Việt Nam.
người gốc Việt Nam là
cái cuộc hội nghị dân sự ở đây, ngoài những cái phong trào này thì có những trường hợp người Việt hải ngoại thân cộng và đã về Việt Nam, thì theo Thục Vi, như người đó đã có giúp gì cho phong trào đòi nhân quyền tự do cho Việt Nam hay không? Và xin Thục Vi cho lời nhắn nhủ cho những người ấy. Xin cảm ơn.
Thưa cô Trâm, trước khi kết thúc buổi hội với Bình Thục Vi, tôi cũng muốn chia sẻ một cái mẫu chuyện nhỏ và lại có một vị nào đó anh Thục Vi học anh dân bao nhiêu năm, thì tôi xin nói là chỉ trong vòng một tuần lễ thôi, Bình Thục Vi đã trở thành một người rất là xuất sắc, đúng không Bình Thục Vi?
Yes. Yes.
Là quý vị có biết là Thục Vi rất là mắc cỡ, không có muốn xuất hiện live, bắt chúng tôi là phải thâu lại thôi. Nhưng mà tôi nói một người như hình Thục Vi là phải xuất hiện live thì mọi người mới quan tâm nhiều hơn, đúng không quý vị?
Yes, yes.
Quý vị biết tại sao mà Thục Vi không xuất hiện live không? Không phải sợ đâu, nhưng mà không có tiền internet. Ban ngày sẽ xài internet chung và ban đêm người ta cắt internet, đúng không Thục Vi?
Chắc là
em nói thật. Đó, cho nên em cứ nói tối người ta cắt internet của em rồi, làm sao mà em lên được? Cho nên đó em phải chỉ cái khẩu được thôi, nhưng mà cuối cùng thì Bình Thục Vi cũng đã dành được một số tiền và nó mua thêm cái mạng lưới internet để đến quý vị tối nay. Vâng, đó là câu chuyện nhỏ tôi muốn chia sẻ về Bình Thục Vi với quý vị.
Thank you.
Hỏi là cảm nghĩ của Bình Thục Vi như thế nào về giới trẻ trong nước, và cô ấy có được bao nhiêu người bạn trẻ trong họ con ủng hộ cuộc của cô ấy?
Cô nghe được không?
Dạ, có bao nhiêu người ở đâu bạn chị?
Bao nhiêu người giới trẻ trong nước ủng hộ con đường của em đang đi?
Em thực sự không biết là có bao nhiêu bạn trẻ ủng hộ cái con đường này. Em nghĩ số này không có ít đâu, nhưng mà với cái sự đàn áp hiện nay của chính quyền Việt Nam mà tất cả các anh chị em và cô chú bác đã thấy thì mọi người rất là sợ, rất là lo ngại. Ngay cả những người đã là thành viên của Hội Nhân quyền Việt Nam rồi thì họ cũng rất là ngại phải tham gia những cái hoạt động với chị em chúng em, tại vì họ sợ là khi mà tụ tập lại thì có thứ để cho chính quyền Việt Nam trừng phạt và đàn áp. Chị nghe nói không ạ? Nói không?
Ok, thôi xin mời chị câu hỏi cuối cùng. Dạ, đây không phải là câu hỏi như là một đề nghị. Ngọc Giao xin nói tiếng Việt và xin Nhật nói là tiếng Anh. Là vấn đề chính mà Thục Vinh nói là mọi người bị đàn áp. Thì xin đề nghị là có thể nào chúng ta làm một cái mối dây liên lạc giữa Thục Thượng Vi và các bạn trong nhóm cùng với Tòa đại sứ Hoa Kỳ và Tòa đại sứ tất cả các nước ở tại Việt Nam cùng với Liên Hiệp Quốc để mà chúng ta nếu cần thì mọi người có thể ngay lập tức gọi phone hay là liên lạc với nhau và chúng ta ở ngoài này có thể cùng một lúc lên tiếng như là Thượng Vi đã yêu cầu. This question actually is a suggestion for Ambassador Rees and for Sarah. I just suggest to Thượng Vi that we somehow set up a hotline that all the members of her organization and all the civil societies who felt that they are under the surveillance by the communist government, that they can have contact of protection from the U.S. Embassy, also from Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations, a hotline of some sort, so that if something happens to them, they can immediately notify us and we can then activate our call lines or tree lines to let the UN or let the international community know. That way somehow the Vietnamese government know that they are free to suppress these civil society activists.
That is a very difficult problem. Maybe I can give an example from Cambodia, where I worked for a long time, with the difference with Vietnam. In Cambodia, if a human rights defender is attacked, there are several things that can be done simultaneously. People can call the Cambodian Human Rights Organization. There's 10. They can call one of them and speak in Cambodian language to them and say, help, help, help. They can also call, or someone can call the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They've had an office in Cambodia for 20 years. UN monitors wearing blue baseball caps show up in a white car and try to help. They can call a diplomat if they have a relationship with the embassy or something like that. International human rights groups based there, they can also call them to let them know the information. But in Vietnam, several of these factors are missing. There is no international human rights organization on the ground based in Vietnam, nor are they allowed to visit without having their trips carefully controlled. And in terms of the calling the UN from Vietnam in a situation like this, it can't happen as well. I think diplomatic contacts can be helpful, but there are so many people who need help, not just in Hanoi, but throughout the whole countryside, that the idea of a hotline is a bit problematic. I think one of the things that's been most impressive in Vietnam is seeing how quickly the in-country bloggers and citizen journalists and defenders get the information out. So, when elderly Nguyen Hu Cao was released recently after more than 34 years in prison, the first person that I saw to get that news out was the journalist Cho Min Duc, who, he scooped RFA and BBC, he got it out immediately. And so there is a blogging network inside Vietnam that has a real sense of how to get information out quickly. And then the challenge is to make sure that the embassies are looking at that, international groups are looking at that, UN is looking at that. And if the messages are in Vietnamese, it's not really a big problem. I mean, there can be ways to translate even using the internet. But I think setting up a situation where just organizing it a little bit better so if you go to channels that can help, not just to the blogosphere, but also, determining, okay, people are being beaten up in this province now, so, where to get the report, where to send the report is one way to do it.
Yes, I agree with everything Sarah said, including the subtext, which is that in a place like Vietnam, having contacts on the outside is a mixed blessing. And whether it's on balance a blessing or a curse depends on the circumstances. Now, in the case of somebody who's already as well known to the Vietnamese government, it's good that we also know about her. And our embassy and our consulate in Saigon, sometimes they do try to keep track of these things. They can't give a Vietnamese citizen who's in trouble with their own government the kind of protection they could give an American citizen who was in the same kind of trouble. But when Lê Kong Nhan had just gotten out of jail, we arranged for somebody from an NGO in Cambodia, or rather in Bangkok, who happened to be visiting Vietnam. We arranged for them to meet in a coffee house. And the young man from the NGO in Bangkok saw her being arrested and carried away by 4 people. Well, our embassy was very, very helpful, and I think that was partly because they were so proud of the fact that they'd been able to get the Vietnamese government to let her out of jail, and she was high profile enough, prominent enough, that even though she's not an American, our embassy was willing to do whatever it took, and the next day she was out of jail again. And talking to Dr. Tom on the phone over Radio Free Asia. So sometimes our embassy or another foreign embassy in Hanoi or a consulate in Saigon can help. But, you know, the Vietnamese government is definitely in charge. They have got all the guns, they have got all the power, they have got all the nerve. And so I can say that to our colleague, that you have a lot of friends in this room, and you've got a lot of friends in the United States, and we will do, if anything happens to you, we're going to do everything that we possibly can to help. But I can't make that a promise because, I can't make it a promise that what we do will work, because the Vietnamese government, as she knows better than we do, is a peculiar animal that has different moods on different days.
Thank you, our 3 panelists. And we have, now is the wrap up for a minute. We have 3 recommendations if you agree with this. That is ratify the OPCAS, which have instrumental ways to make Vietnam to end torturing, and 2 is to help to build the civil society, an NGO organization from Vietnam, whether through financial support, and 3 is to give them protection without in any ways that we could, to reach out to disseminate information as fast as we could to the international community and the foreign embassies in Vietnam. Yes. Thank you very much for your participation, and the conference is adjourned. Yes.
Chương trình thảo luận của chúng ta đến đây để chấm dứt. Chúng tôi hy vọng sẽ được gặp lại tất cả quý vị.
Cảm ơn thực viên muốn nói vài câu.
Vâng.
Hôm nay tôi rất là vinh dự được nói chuyện với tất cả quý vị. Xin cảm ơn tất cả quý vị vì nỗ lực lên và ủng hộ cho những người đấu tranh cho dân chủ và nhân quyền Việt Nam. Chúng tôi biết là việc đòi hỏi dân chủ nhân quyền là việc của mỗi người dân Việt Nam, và việc xây dựng nền tảng cho dân chủ là việc của các tổ chức xã hội dân sự Việt Nam. Nhưng sự ủng hộ của tất cả quý vị sẽ là niềm ủng hộ to lớn đối với cái hành trình đầy khó khăn của chúng tôi, và chúng tôi rất cảm ơn quý vị về sự ủng hộ đó. Xin cảm ơn tất cả quý vị.
Mọi người gửi lời chào Thực Vi và tất cả các bạn trẻ.
Nhìn nhận chưa anh?
Rồi, xong rồi. Cảm ơn.
Ok, that's it.
Vâng, chúng ta có hơn 1 tiếng để nghỉ hoặc là để có thể đi trở về lại khách sạn hoặc là trở về lại nhà hàng. Xin gặp lại tất cả quý vị tối hôm nay ở nhà hàng Harvest Moon để chúng ta thảo luận tiếp những cái hành trình chúng ta cần phải làm và những điều gì trong những ngày tháng tới.
Tới đây là phải làm giật giật. Mà được khen đấy.
Sói quá chạy qua bên kia, chạy xây lại. Dính hết rồi.
Đứng lại đây, đứng lại đây.
Gom lại, gom lại. Hà vô Hà.
United we stand.
Stay stronger.
United we stand.
Rồi một người chụp.
Chụp xấu là quanh thở chụp hình đó nha.
Chị Ghi bắt cặp đi, bắt cặp đi.